This story is about a baffling disappearance that happened in 2020 in a forest in California. But the most unique part of this disappearance is the incredibly spooky twist that happened very recently. This twist is something that the Madera County Sheriff's Office, who is in charge of investigating this disappearance, they're still trying to wrap their head around what even happened. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once a week. So if that's of interest to you, please sign the like button up for your very casual, very friendly, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when it's their turn at bat, switch the machine out for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On March 11th, 2020, the World Health Organization declared that the COVID-19 outbreak was so bad that it had become a global pandemic, which meant this new highly infectious disease had spread virtually everywhere on the planet. And so around the time this global pandemic announcement was made, governments around the world began instructing their citizens to stay home and avoid all physical contact with other people outside of the people that you lived with. The idea being these quarantine measures would help stop the spread of the virus. Initially, world leaders and citizens believed these quarantine measures would have a dramatic impact and it would stop the spread, and before long, COVID would be under control and life would just kind of magically go back to normal. But unfortunately, that is not what happened. By June, so 3 months into the global pandemic, positive COVID cases were only going up, not down. And so it was around that point in June that people all over the world were starting to come to terms with the reality that COVID was not this simple problem with a simple solution. It was a complex health issue that likely was going to be around for a long time, which also meant these strict quarantine measures also would likely be around for some time. Now, the efficacy of these quarantine measures were quickly called into question, and it was all over the news, and politicians, all they wanted to talk about was, do these measures work? Is it having an effect on the spread of the virus? But for everyday people, the real concern was not politics, it was practicality. How do you live a full and happy life in quarantine? In June of that year, 54-year-old Sandra Hughes was pondering that question. To that point, her life had really not gone the way she had planned it. She had been married, twice actually, but both relationships had ended in divorce, and she had never had children. She lived in beautiful Maui, Hawaii, but she hadn't really lived there long enough to consider it her home, and prior to that, for the bulk of her adult life, she'd kind of lived this nomad lifestyle, bouncing around all over the country, and so really she had never developed a home of sorts. She was an accountant by trade, but in college, she had studied not just accounting, but also wilderness survival, which she happened to be incredible at and was very passionate about. Growing up, she had always been a big outdoor enthusiast, and so she had always thought one day she would become a park ranger, and so that's why she was studying wilderness survival in college. But as these things go, after she graduated college, she did not become a park ranger. She became an accountant, and now 30 years later, here she was. However, in June of that year, with COVID quarantine restrictions putting her and everyone else's life basically on pause, Sandra suddenly saw an opportunity, and that was to embrace this break from reality and spend this strange time in history back out in nature, getting back in touch with her roots as an outdoor survivalist. And so at the end of that June, Sandra would sell her place in Maui and she would move to Madera County, California, which is located smack dab in the center of California, situated just south of Yosemite National Park and just north of the Sierra National Forest. Then on June 26th, after Sandra had gotten settled in her new place in California, she would contact her family and tell them that she planned on going on this extended solo camping trip in the Sierra National Forest, and that she would be in touch with them in the coming weeks when she was back out. To Sandra, this trip was going to bring her lots of happiness and fulfillment, and it was going to allow her to continue to adhere to quarantine guidelines because she'd be all alone. Shortly after speaking with her family on the 26th, Sandra loaded up all of her camping equipment into her silver Saab sedan, and then she would drive from her place south and then east a little over an hour until she was deep inside of the Sierra National Forest. At some point, she would leave the main road and she would hop onto a bumpy dirt road that kind of wound through the forest, and that road would bring her out to an area called the Johnson Meadows. The Johnson Meadows are absolutely gorgeous. It looks straight out of a postcard. It's basically a stretch of beautiful green meadows, and then around the perimeter of those meadows are the thick trees of the Sierra National Forest, and then beyond those trees are the snow-capped Sierra Mountains. But despite its beauty, the Johnson Meadows are actually fairly dangerous. It's a very isolated part of the Sierra National Forest, and there are lots of cougars and bears and other natural hazards in the area, so it's not really a place you go unless you're prepared to be there. And Sandra was certainly that, both in terms of her survival experience and the gear she brought with her. So when Sandra drove her car right up to the edge of the Johnson Meadows, she parked her car off to the side of the road so as not to block the road, and then she got out, she collected her things from the trunk, and then she threw it over her shoulder and began hiking into the middle of the Johnson Meadows to look for a place to set up her campsite. 6 days later, on July 2nd, some hikers came out of the tree line into Johnson Meadows and began walking across the center of it. And as they're walking along, they notice up ahead what looks like a tent and a campsite. They don't see anybody near it, but they clearly see someone is camping in the middle of Johnson Meadows. And so this is totally not unusual. Lots of people go hiking and camping in this area. And so these hikers just began kind of creating a wide berth around this person's campsite because they didn't want to cut right through the middle of it as they went across the meadow. But as they're making this kind of wide berth around this campsite, they looked over at it, and as they passed by it, they noticed that the campsite was definitely abandoned, and it looked totally destroyed, like a tornado had crossed right across it. And so when they were parallel with this campsite, the hikers decided to actually go over and look at it and see what was going on. And so they walked over to this campsite and they're looking around and they see there's a backpack that's clearly been dumped out and all of its contents are strewn around all over the ground. There's unopened cans of food, there's papers and documents, the tent is in ruins. I mean, the place is just a total mess. And so the hikers didn't really know what to make of this. They couldn't tell if a person had kind of intentionally ransacked this site or if maybe an animal had come through. But as a precaution, they marked down on their map where this destroyed campsite was, and then they hiked out of the forest. And when they were back in cell phone range, they called the Madera County Sheriff's Office and they reported the site. And so later that day, some Madera County sheriffs made their way out to Johnson Meadows, and sure enough, the campsite is still there, it's still in ruins, and it's still abandoned. And so they would search the campsite and they would find some ID cards, and the name on those ID cards was Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs would leave the forest and get in touch with Sandra's family to find out if they knew why Sandra had left her campsite the way she had. But when Sandra's family heard about the state of Sandra's campsite, they had an immediate and definitive reaction to it. They told the sheriffs that Sandra was incredibly environmentally conscious and was very cleanly, and so she would never, ever leave her campsite looking that way on purpose. Something else had to have happened. The family would also tell the sheriffs that they had not spoken with Sandra since the 26th when she started her trip, and so they had no idea where she could be now. And so naturally, the family was concerned, the sheriffs were concerned, and so that day they filed an official missing person report. Over the next 2 days, a massive search was launched in Johnson Meadows and the surrounding area to look for Sandra. And so hundreds of people were out on foot, they had sniffer dogs out, there were helicopters in the air, and during the search, the Madera County Sheriff's Office was interviewing anybody who was out there, hikers, campers, and asking them if they had had any contact with Sandra, because Sandra was actually quite distinctive looking. Before she left for this trip, she had dyed her hair blue. But unfortunately, no one had seen Sandra, and despite this massive search effort over these first 2 days, nothing new was discovered that could lead authorities to where she had gone. But then on July 4th, so 2 days into her disappearance, Sandra Hughes was spotted. Before we get to the rest of today's video, I want to tell you about today's sponsor, NordVPN. I used to be just like you, spending every waking second combing the internet looking for the perfect pictures of a gift horse's mouth to give to the like button, only to be rudely interrupted by pesky pop-up ads. But my entire life changed when I found out about NordVPN. A VPN, or virtual private network, is a service that keeps you safe when you browse the internet, and NordVPN is the name brand in that space. Not only will NordVPN ensure that your data stays safely behind their wall of next-generation encryption, but also, through their newest feature, Threat Protection, they will block all those pesky pop-up ads that keep ruining your gift horse mouth picture buying that keep ruining your gift horse mouth picture buying experience. NordVPN's Threat Protection also protects their users from malicious sites, downloads, and trackers. In short, with NordVPN, your internet browsing will be safer, smoother, and full of many more pictures of gift horses' mouths to give to the like button. So, if that sounds as enticing as I think it does, then you need to check out NordVPN. And you're in luck, because the very best offer NordVPN has right now is through my YouTube offer. Right now, NordVPN is offering viewers an exclusive 2-year plan at a massive discount, plus 1 month free when you go to nordvpn.com/mrballen. And this offer is risk-free because Nord has a 30-day money-back guarantee. Again, go to nordvpn.com/mrballen or just click on the link in the description below. Pop-up ads! Okay, back to the story. Some hikers were cutting through the Johnson Meadows area, and they saw this woman who was just standing off to the side of the meadow. She was by herself. She had no gear with her. She was barefoot. She had a black shirt on. She had blue jeans on. She had a bruise on her face, and she was just kind of standing there as if she was waiting for something. And as these hikers walked past her, they definitely noticed her, but she didn't wave them down. She didn't act distressed. She didn't look like she needed any help. They just kind of saw this person minding their own business, and they walked right on past her. It wasn't until those hikers got to the parking lot that they saw all these missing person flyers out for Sandra Hughes, and they would see the picture of Sandra, and they would see her distinctive blue hair, that they would say, oh my goodness, the barefoot woman we just saw standing in the forest is Sandra Hughes. And so the hikers called the sheriff's office. The sheriff's office got really jazzed up. They headed out to where they had claimed to have seen her, but there was no sign of her, and there was nothing left behind that would indicate where she might have gone. The following day, on July 5th, Sandra's vehicle was located, but Sandra was not with it. It was found 5 miles north of where her destroyed campsite was in Johnson Meadows, and the vehicle was actually at the bottom of a ravine, and this ravine was right next to a winding forest road. And so after looking at the damage on the front of the car, authorities believed Sandra was driving the car on that road and then hit a tree, and then she rolled off the embankment down to the bottom of the ravine. There was no blood inside the vehicle, so it wasn't immediately clear if this accident had actually done any physical harm to Sandra. But the most significant thing about the discovery of this vehicle was the state of Sandra's personal effects that had been in the vehicle. Clearly, after the vehicle had come to a stop at the bottom of the ravine, someone had pulled out all of the things inside of the car, all of Sandra's personal things, and kind of thrown them carelessly all over the forest floor, as if they were kind of rummaging through her car looking for something, throwing things as they went. And the Madera County sheriffs couldn't help but think that this was eerily similar to how her campsite looked in Johnson Meadows, where all of her personal effects had just kind of been chucked all over the place. At this point, authorities did not believe Sandra was actively trying to evade them. Instead, they thought, maybe Sandra got hurt, maybe back at the campsite or even during this car accident, and the injury has impaired her cognitive abilities, and so now, maybe she's lost in the woods and doesn't know what's going on. There was some discussion about foul play maybe being involved, but that was largely discounted. And so a decision was made to just leave her vehicle where it was at the bottom of the ravine, thinking, maybe Sandra is going to come back to this vehicle, and maybe that's why all these things have been strewn around, because she's coming back and looking for something. And so authorities left a note in the window of her vehicle that said, hey, Sandra, we're looking for you. Please call this number if you see this. And then at the bottom of this note, it said, your family really misses you. The search for Sandra would continue over the next several days with a new focus around the area where the car had been found, but nothing new was discovered. Then, on the evening of July 12th, so 1 week after the vehicle was discovered, a team of searchers had made their way 2.5 miles north of the vehicle, and they were actually inside of Yosemite National Park. They were barely inside, and they were right up along this lake called the Spotted Lake. Now, this is an area that's very difficult to get to. There are no main roads that get there. There are no main trails that get there. And so the searchers, they're up in this very rugged part of Yosemite, and as they're walking along with their flashlights out, they see a sleeping bag, and it's laying out right in the middle of the ground, in the middle of nowhere, and it looks like it's been used recently, and it would turn out that sleeping bag was Sandra's. But again, when they brought all the searchers out to that area and they searched all around the Spotted Lake and all over this area, there was no sign of Sandra. At this point, authorities were totally baffled. On a map, Johnson Meadows, where her first campsite was, then her vehicle, and then this sleeping bag were all more or less in a straight line going south to north. It was almost like Sandra, from the day she went missing, had just begun slowly working her way to the north, but she was doing it without any equipment and most likely barefoot in an area that was steep and rugged and dangerous and full of cougars and bears. And so authorities knew if they didn't find her soon, even if she was doing this on purpose, she was likely going to succumb to the elements. The search for Sandra would continue for another week after the discovery of her sleeping bag, but by that time, by July 20th, there hadn't been any new developments. No one had seen Sandra, there were no new leads, and so unfortunately, the authorities had to scale back their search. About 3 weeks later, on August 9th, 2 hunters were driving down this very desolate forest road, located several miles to the east of where Sandra's car had been found. And as they're driving along, they turn this corner, and as soon as they do, they look up ahead and they see there's this woman. Now, she's not standing on the road or even right next to the road. She's kind of tucked up a ways on this hillside in the trees, and she's leaning up against a tree. And so the hunters are looking at her and they're seeing that she's got no equipment with her. There's no backpack, there's nothing, no tent, and there's no other people anywhere. I mean, they're in a very isolated part of this forest, and it's odd to see people here to begin with, let alone this woman who's just kind of casually standing up against a tree. And so the hunters, they're like, okay, let's drive up and see if she needs something. And so they pull up right up alongside her. She's still, 10, 15 feet away from them, tucked up in the trees. And so they roll their windows down and they're looking up at her, trying to kind of flag her and get her attention. But the woman is not paying attention to them at all. She just continues to prop herself up against this tree and just kind of stares off into the distance. And so the hunters, they're looking up at her thinking, what's going on with this woman? And they kind of called out to her. They tried to wave her down, but there was nothing. There was no interactions with them. And so ultimately the hunters thought, okay, well, we don't know what this woman's doing, but it seems like she's here on purpose and she doesn't seem like she's in distress. She doesn't look hurt. And so they just decided to carry on. And so they drove off. And then later that day, they would see one of the missing person flyers for Sandra Hughes. And they saw the blue hair in the picture and they were like, oh my goodness, the woman we saw standing up against the tree in the middle of the forest was that woman, Sandra Hughes. The hunters would contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office and report the sighting, and they would describe Sandra as looking slightly thinner than the picture of her on her missing person flyer, and they would also say she was wearing overalls and a floral t-shirt, which was interesting to sheriffs because the last time Sandra was sighted, which was on July 4th, when those hikers had seen her barefoot with a bruise on her face near Johnson Meadows, she had been wearing a black shirt and blue jeans. And so clearly she had changed her outfit, but that didn't really make any sense because she had left all of her things at the campsite and her car, and so the whole situation was just totally weird to the sheriffs. But regardless, they headed out to that road where the hunters had seen Sandra, but like always, Sandra was not there, and there was no sign she had ever been there. After this, Sandra's case went cold, and so authorities and her family began to brace for the reality that they likely would never see her again. But there was one more terrifying twist coming. A year later, on Wednesday, July 21st, 2021, Jake Gorba, his wife Victoria, and their 3 young children were driving in Jake's off-roading vehicle up the steep forest road in the middle of Sierra National Forest on their way to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. Shut-Eye Peak is a mountain in the Sierra National Forest with stunning panoramic views from the top, and it's located about 5 miles to the south of Johnson Meadows, where Sandra's first campsite was discovered. So Jake and his family, they're driving their way up this long, bumpy, winding forest road, making their way towards the top of Shut-Eye Peak. And when they get about halfway, the kids in the back start complaining that they're hungry. And so Jake and Victoria, they decide, you know what, let's just pull over at the next natural stopping point and we'll have a quick lunch and then we'll continue on the rest of the way. And as luck would have it, the road they were on would actually level off and lead them to this kind of short, flat section of the mountain. And in this flat section was this beautiful little meadow that butted up against some trees. And so Jake and his wife thought this is a great place to stop and have a little picnic. And so he pulled his truck over on the side of the road, he parked it, he turned the engine off, and then as Jake and his wife are kind of gathering up their things before they get out of the vehicle to go prepare this picnic lunch, they hear their 3-year-old son, named Caden, who's in the back seat right near a window, start talking. And so Jake and Victoria instinctively turned around to see who Caden was talking to, and they saw Caden was not talking to himself, he was not talking to his siblings, he was turned and looking out his open window, looking across this small meadow into the forest, engaged in some sort of intense conversation with somebody outside. And so Jake and Victoria, they see their son and they look out the window in the direction he's looking and talking, and they don't see anyone. And so Victoria, she looks at her son and goes, "Caden, who are you talking to?" And what he would say to her would send goosebumps all over her body. And in fact, what would happen over the next several minutes from that point onward was so unsettling that Jake and Victoria decided, you know what, we're not going to the top of Shut-Eye Peak. We're turning around and we're leaving. And so they would speed out of the forest and they would get back home. And that night, Victoria would make a Facebook post about what her son said and this terrifying ordeal they experienced on Shut-Eye Peak, and she would post it. And that night, the Madera County Sheriff's Office would reach out to Victoria via a Facebook message, and they would tell her, "Hey, we saw your post. Can we please speak to you and your son?" And so the next day, the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, and after speaking with Caden and hearing what he had to say, they would leave that exchange just as unsettled as Caden's parents. The day before, when Victoria turned around and looked at Caden and said, "Who are you talking to?" Caden would turn away from the window and look at his mom, and he would say, "There's a woman out there and she needs our help." And he starts pointing out the window. And so again, Jake and Victoria, they look from their son back out the window into the tree line, which is where Caden is pointing, and they don't see anyone. And so they turn back to Caden and they say, "Honey, we don't see anyone out there." And Caden, at this point, he becomes emphatic and he says, "Mom, you gotta trust me. She's right there. She needs our help. She's lying face down. Her legs are straight up and she's dead." And so at this point, Victoria and Jake are looking at their son thinking, what's going on here? Jake promptly hops out of the car and just starts running into the woods to see what's going on. Is there a person out here? But he's out there looking around and there's no one. And while he's out there, his son is pointing in the direction of where he is, claiming there's this woman right near him. And so Jake's looking around thinking, there's no one out here. I have no idea what my son's on about. And so he's spooked. He runs back to the car. And when he gets inside, Caden is still looking out the window. He's pointing and he's talking to this dead woman that needs their help. And so Jake and Victoria, they were horrified. They turned around, they left. And then that night, when Victoria made that Facebook post, she included in the post what this woman apparently looked like based on what Caden said. And what Caden said was she had a black t-shirt on, blue jeans on, and blue hair. And so when the Madera County Sheriff's Office saw this post that described seeing a person in a black shirt, blue jeans, and blue hair, they knew that description matched Sandra Hughes. And so when the sheriffs met up with the Gorba family, they brought with them a lineup of several women, and they went right up to Caden, and without giving him any extra information, they just showed him all these pictures of all these women. And they said, "Caden, can you identify in any of these pictures the woman you saw in the woods?" and Caden looks at these pictures, and he picks out 3 pictures. All 3 are Sandra Hughes. The sheriffs, along with Caden and his father, they would return to that section of Shut-Eye Peak to search the tree line near the meadow to see if there was any sign of Sandra or any indication that she had been there, but like always, there was nothing. As of today, we still have no idea where Sandra is or what happened to her, and nobody has any idea what to make of the very strange sightings of her that occurred after she went missing. It's all just one big mystery. If anyone has any information about Sandra Hughes, you are encouraged to contact the Madera County Sheriff's Office. The number is right here and also in the description. So that's going to do it. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please sign the like button up for your very friendly, casual, slow machine pitch baseball league. But when they're up at bat, switch out the machine for a grenade launcher. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. We now have a podcast called the Mr. Ballin' Podcast, which puts out brand new, never before heard podcast exclusive stories on Monday mornings. On Thursday mornings, we put out the remastered audio of our most popular YouTube videos. Again, it's just called the Mr. Ballin' Podcast, and you can find it on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Google, basically anywhere you find podcasts, you can find this one. We also have 2 additional YouTube channels. One is a shorts channel called Mr. Ballin Shorts, and the other is a Spanish language channel called Mr. Ballin en Español. We also put out near daily content on our Facebook and Snapchat pages. Those are just called Mr. Ballin. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform. My username on all of them is just @Mr. Ballin, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. We have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballin.com to have a look. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit, just called Mr. Ballin. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, other YouTube channels, the podcast, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Today, we're going to look at 3 places you can't go and people who went there anyways. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2 or 3 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time the like button has a big public speech they have to give, offer them a mint right beforehand. Except this mint is actually a plaque disclosing tablet. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In early 2020, a very popular Russian Instagram influencer named Ekterina Didenko was getting ready to celebrate her 29th birthday. She, along with her husband and some of her influencer friends, were planning to enjoy the occasion at a popular spa in Moscow, Russia. The group rented out a private section of the spa that included a steam room and a small indoor pool. And then once the reservations were made, Didenko and all of her influencer friends began eagerly talking about how excited they were about this party on their various social media accounts. When the day finally came, February 28th, which was Didenko's birthday, Didenko, her husband, and the 8 other people they invited, they all descended on this spa. So they go inside, they go back to their private area, and it's great. There's food, there's alcohol, there's music, they're jumping into the pool, then getting in the hot tub, and everyone's just having a great time. Everyone's taking pictures and filming and live streaming. I mean, it's really going as well as it possibly could be. And then at some point, Didenko's husband signals the rest of the group, minus Didenko, and they all begin to pull out these white hazardous materials suits. Imagine what you would see in a movie if there was some huge chemical leak, a full body white suit with a mask. And so they're all putting on these hazmat suits, and they give one to Didenko, who puts it on as well, and they tell her this is part of her big surprise. Now, it's unclear if Didenko actually didn't know what was going to happen next, or if she's just pretending to be surprised because it would do better on social media, because this is all being filmed and she's an influencer. But either way, she puts on her hazmat suit, and once everyone has their suits on, Didenko's husband wheeled in this huge cooler like you would bring to a picnic, and he placed it right on the edge of the pool. When he opened the lid, the crowd all gasped and laughed and smiled and filmed as these huge clouds of smoke or steam came pouring out of it. What it was roughly 55 pounds of dry ice. Dry ice is just frozen carbon dioxide. It's commonly used for things like refrigerating perishable goods for long periods of time because dry ice stays cold for a really long time. Also, because of the huge white gas clouds that come off of dry ice, it's also very commonly used as a sort of spooky decoration because you have these very cool white clouds going everywhere. And in fact, that's what Didenko's husband planned to use this dry ice for. He was going to dump it into the pool and create those big white gas clouds all over the pool. The reason they call it dry ice is because as it starts to heat up, it doesn't melt into a liquid state the way frozen water does. Instead, it goes directly from a solid state to a gas state. Dry ice is considered to be quite hazardous if it's handled inappropriately, and while these partygoers all had their hazmat suits on, it's unlikely they were actually wearing them for safety. It's far more likely they were wearing them because it would look good on social media and would kind of hype up the stunt they were about to do. And so after the dry ice was revealed inside of this cooler, Didenko's husband and another of the partygoers grabbed the sides of the cooler and they dumped its contents directly into the water. And as soon as the dry ice hit the water, it rapidly began to warm up, which caused a massive, almost explosion of carbon dioxide gas to completely fill the lower half of the room. Now, none of the partygoers are even a little bit fazed by what's happening. They don't realize how dangerous this actually is. And so they're just filming and laughing and kind of thinking this is so funny. And then Didenko's husband actually leaps through the cloud into the water and kind of disappears below. And then shortly after that, two other partygoers would also leap into the pool. One of the main reasons dry ice is considered to be so hazardous if handled inappropriately is because dry ice emits that carbon dioxide gas, which at high concentrations will displace oxygen. So imagine if you're in a very small room that has very poor ventilation. If you had lots of carbon dioxide in there, you would suffocate. And so this indoor pool was a small confined space with poor ventilation. And so the 7 people on the pool deck, shortly after this dry ice has been tossed into the pool, they started to realize it was really hard to breathe because the oxygen was basically being sucked out of the room. And so they were able to turn and actually run out of the pool deck before it was too late. Meanwhile, Didenko's husband and the other 2 people who leapt into the pool, when they came back to the surface, they breathed in thinking they would be breathing in oxygen, but instead they breathed in an entire lungful of carbon dioxide, which in addition to displacing oxygen at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation, it is also poisonous at higher concentrations inside of confined spaces with poor ventilation. And so when the 3 of them surfaced, they breathed in this poisonous gas, which caused 2 of them to immediately pass out and then just die, while the third, Didenko's husband, he managed to stay conscious enough that he was able to climb barely out of the pool, and he tried to get to the door, but he couldn't get out in time. Eventually, he was pulled out and rushed to the hospital, but he would later die, not only from carbon dioxide poisoning, but also from having gone without oxygen for as long as he had. On Saturday, September 30th, 2017, a staff member at a North Wales country club noticed water leaking out of the bottom of an outside wall of one of their many bungalows. These bungalows, which were generally just vacation rentals, were single-story white structures situated up on this beautiful green hillside. The staff member, after seeing this leak, they just turn around and go back to the front office and they tell their boss about it. And then shortly after, 2 maintenance workers were sent out to check on this leak. And so these 2 workers, they go over to this bungalow and they knock on the front door. But after a while, when no one comes to the door, they pull out their master key and they begin to turn the lock. And as they do that, they yell out just in case, hey, we're here just to check on a leak. We have to come in. It's a potential emergency. And so they open up the door, they swing it open, and no one comes to the door. It's still silent. And they're looking into this property. And what they see is on the left, from their perspective, is a kitchen. And on their right is a living room. It was basically one big room that had been designated for 2 distinct functions. And so they yelled out again into this bungalow, hey, we're coming inside. We're just checking on this leak. And then they just walked straight across past the living room and past the kitchen to the back of this property, where they reached a door. And this door led into a bedroom, and this door was shut. And so just as a precaution, they knocked on the bedroom door, but nobody came to the door again. So they opened up the bedroom door and they looked into this room, and on the right side of the room, tucked up against the right wall, were two twin beds, where the head of each bed was tucked up against the wall. And then in the middle of the room, at the base of these two beds, was a pile of unopened luggage. And so to the two maintenance workers, this told them that someone clearly was staying in this bungalow. Either they had just arrived or they were getting ready to leave, but apparently they were not there right now. And so the workers walked around the luggage and around the two beds. So they walked on the left side of the room all the way to the back, where there was another closed door, and it went into the bathroom. And based on where the leak had been coming out of the structure, they believed it would be coming from this particular bathroom. And so again, they get up to this door and they knock on it because, they want to make sure no one's in there, but there's more silence. And so they open up the bathroom, and right away they see water all over the bathroom floor. But as they scan around the bathroom, they look at the sink, they look at the shower, the toilet, none of them are overflowing or running. So it was not any of the usual suspects that had caused this leak. However, there was one other area in the bathroom that could have caused a water leak, and that was the airing cupboard. An airing cupboard is typically where you keep a hot water heater. It's basically like a walk-in closet where the majority of the space is taken up by this heater. And also generally people put in shelves in front of the heater to store their linens and towels and that sort of thing. And in this bungalow, the airing cupboard had its own door, and it was right in the bathroom, and this door to the airing cupboard was right to the left of the door that led into the bathroom from the bedroom. And so these two workers, they reached over and they opened the door that led into this airing cupboard. And as soon as it swung in, they could tell right away where the leak was coming from. And they could tell right away they had a much, much bigger problem. 7 days earlier, 60-year-old former policewoman Mary Isherwood arrived at the North Wales Country Club. She and her ex-husband had for a long time owned one of these bungalows. However, they almost never stayed in it. They basically used it as an income property, renting it out to vacation goers. But they had recently decided that they wanted to actually sell the property. And so before the sale became final, Mary had told her ex-husband that she just wanted to go and spend a week actually enjoying the property and actually take a vacation there. And so originally, she and some friends were going to go to this bungalow and spend a week there. But right before they were going to leave, Mary's friends all said they couldn't make it. And so Mary decided she would just go on her own. And so Mary arrives at this country club. It's late at night when she gets there. She gets to the bungalow. She puts her luggage down in her bedroom. And then instead of just kind of getting settled in and going to sleep, she decides she's going to go exercise. Mary was incredibly fit and healthy. She loved playing golf and running and exercising in general. And she knew the club had a pool. And so she reached into her luggage and she just pulled out a bathing suit. She switched into that, and then she went down to the pool and did some lap swimming. After that, she came back to her room where she took a shower, and then she climbed in bed without any clothes on. That was just how Mary liked to sleep. And then at some point in the middle of the night, Mary woke up to go use the bathroom. And so she hopped out of her twin bed. She walked around to the door that led into the bathroom. She went inside, she did her business. And then afterwards, as she was attempting to go back into her bedroom, she accidentally grabbed the door handle of the airing cupboard, which was right to the left of the door leading back to her bedroom. She opened it up, it swung inward. She stepped into the airing cupboard, which was totally pitch black. And as she walked in, she might have bumped into the shelves or realized, this was the wrong turn. But as soon as this happened, the door behind her had actually shut. And so she's inside of this tiny airing cupboard, realizing, okay, this is not where I need to go. I've made a silly mistake. She turned around to grab the door handle to open the airing cupboard back up again. But when she grabbed the knob, it disintegrated in her hands. It broke into multiple parts and fell to the ground. Now, this space she is in is pitch black. She has no way of knowing which parts go where for this doorknob. And so by touch, she reached down and she grabbed all these pieces, and she probably tried tried to put them together and put it back on this door to try to get it open, but she just couldn't do it. And so eventually, Mary would have realized this is a pretty serious situation. She was staying at this bungalow by herself, and she was not expected to check out for another week. So no one was going to be checking on her, and without this doorknob, she could not open this closet door. It was a hard wooden door, the locking mechanism was solid, there was just no way to open it without this doorknob. And so Mary began banging on the door and screaming out for help, but her bungalow was not actually connected to any other structures. It was a standalone. And so her voice did not carry very far, and the banging sounds she was making, those also did not carry very far. And so no one heard her. And so after several hours, she's just standing in this closet, probably thinking to herself, how in the world did I get myself in this position? But after the initial shock of this totally bizarre situation she was in had worn off, she decided to act. And so she turned away from the door and she faced towards the back of this closet. She would have been face to face with a row of shelves, but she wouldn't have been able to see the shelves because it was totally dark. And then beyond the shelves, farther into this closet, was the actual hot water heater. There was no wall behind the shelves. Basically, there was a space behind the shelves where this heater was. And so Mary grabbed one of these shelves and she managed to break it off the wall. And then she turned around and used this piece of wood and tried to smash the door, but very quickly realized that was just going to do nothing. However, she began striking the wall right next to the door, and she realized she could break through the drywall. She was starting to kind of burrow a hole. And so maybe she thought to herself, if I can just build a hole big enough right next to the door, I can reach through the hole and maybe open this cupboard from the outside. And so she began using this shelf to smash this wall, and she's burrowing as fast as she can, but the progress must have been very, very slow because she decides she needs a different tool. So she turns back around, so she's facing the shelves again, and she breaks down a few more shelves to clear a path to get to the water heater. And then once she could step past the shelves, once there was a path, she got right in front of this water heater, and then by touch began feeling around for any pipes extending off of the heater. And when she found one, she got a good grip of it, and she began yanking and tugging on it until she managed to rip a piece of pipe off of the hot water heater. Now, as soon as she did that, she now had a pipe that was a far better tool for burrowing and creating this hole in the wall. However, as soon as that pipe broke off, cold water began leaking out of this hot water heater, the water that had not been heated yet. And it was being sprayed all over the inside of this cupboard. Now, this was a very small space, and so there was no way for Mary to get out from under this cold water. And so it was a shocking and probably very painful experience. But she now had her tool and figured, okay, this is awful, but I'll just use this tool, I'll burrow this hole, I'll get this cupboard open, and I'll get out of here. And so with the water raining down on her, Mary used her new piece of pipe and began digging and burrowing at that spot right next to the door. But after a while, probably several hours, she struck a brick wall. There was no way she could actually push through this wall and reach around and open the cupboard door. There was nothing she could do. It was a dead end. And so totally devastated and probably very exhausted from all the energy she used to burrow this hole, she stopped. She's still getting rained down on by all this freezing cold water. And instead of just totally giving up, she just turned and faced the wall that was leading into her bedroom. She began digging again, using this tool all over again to now dig a new hole on this other wall, most likely hoping that she could literally burrow a hole big enough that she could actually crawl through into her bedroom and escape. And so after several more hours of digging as fast and as hard as she could, while also periodically banging on the door and screaming out for help, she did eventually push through into her bedroom. However, in a cruel twist of fate, when she did finally poke through this wall, there was no bricks in the way, she hit what felt like another dead end. But in fact, what it was a picture frame with a glass cover across it had been screwed onto the wall in her bedroom. And this painting was right over where she was digging this hole. And so in her totally exhausted and panicked and saddened and scared state, she hits the back of this painting. And again, it's pitch black and she's feeling through the hole most likely, and she's touching this hard back of this painting. And she's realizing, oh my goodness, I've hit another dead end. There's nowhere for me to go. Even though, in reality, she could have very easily just broken through that frame and then maybe made the hole a little bit bigger, and then she could have squeezed through it and escaped. But she didn't know that, and so she eventually just slouched to the ground and accepted her fate. 6 days later, when those two maintenance workers opened the airing cupboard door, they found Mary's body slumped up against the wall inside this closet. She had died of hypothermia. It would turn out other residents of the other bungalows nearby heard banging coming from this bungalow on Saturday night, the night that Mary actually got stuck, and then they also heard the banging the following morning, on Sunday morning. But none of the other residents reported it because they believed it was just construction or some other maintenance work. However, there was one couple staying in one of the nearby bungalows that thought there was something off about this banging, and they told each other, if the banging persists past 5 p.m. on Sunday, so that's the day after Mary got stuck, this couple told each other that if it continues past 5 p.m., we'll report it. But as it happened, Mary stopped banging on the walls and yelling for help right around 5 p.m. on Sunday. And so this couple, right as they're getting ready to go tell the front desk, the banging stopped, and so they stopped worrying about it. It's unclear how long Mary survived after she stopped banging around 5 p.m. on Sunday. It could have been minutes, it could have been hours, it could have been days. Mary's family would ultimately sue the country club for negligence. However, the outcomes of this case have not been made public. On July 30th, 2013, 56-year-old Roger Miro grabbed a bag of trash from his apartment and then walked out into the hall. He turned right and walked down the hall until he reached the trash chute, which was right on the side of the wall. He opened it up. It was like a mailbox. He opened it up. He dropped his trash bag inside. He closed the trash chute and then walked back to his apartment. When he got back inside, he instinctively reached down to his right pocket to grab his cell phone, but it wasn't there. So he grabbed his left pocket, wasn't there either. He checked his back pockets, he's fishing around, and he realizes he doesn't have his phone. So he figures, okay, I must have put it down somewhere in my apartment. Now, Roger was legally blind, so it made looking for small things in his apartment quite difficult. But nonetheless, he began looking all over his apartment for his phone. He started in the kitchen, he looked all over the place, checked all the surfaces, no cell phone. He went to the living room, to the bedroom, to the bathroom, but there was no cell phone. And so Roger thought maybe when he walked to the trash chute, he might have dropped the phone in the hallway. And so he left his apartment, he turned right, and he walked along, retracing his footsteps all the way to the trash chute. But all along the way, there was no phone on the ground. And so as he's standing in front of the opening to this trash chute, he thinks to himself, maybe I accidentally put my phone in the trash bag that I have now just dropped down this trash chute. And so as Roger is standing there wondering what he's supposed to do, one of his neighbors walked out into the hall and looked down and saw Roger standing there kind of inquisitively looking at this opening to the trash chute. And they asked Roger, what's going on? And Roger explained the whole phone situation. And the neighbor said, well, hey, why don't you go down to the first floor and ask the manager if you can get the key to the trash room on the first floor where all the trash goes. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He turned and made his way to the elevator, and the neighbor went back inside of his apartment. Roger went down to the first floor. He went to the manager's office. He knocked on the door. And when the door opened, the manager was obviously very busy with something. And Roger would say, hey, I'm just looking to get into the trash room. I think I might have accidentally thrown my phone away. And I just want to have a look in the trash to see if I can find it. Now, this manager knew he was not allowed to let anybody who lived in the apartment complex go into that trash room on their own. It was a dangerous space. And so the manager was supposed to go in there with them if they needed to go in and look around in the trash. But right when Roger went up to the manager's office, the manager was waiting for a very important phone call and so couldn't really leave his office. But the manager kind of empathized with Roger and felt bad for him and said, okay, you know what? I'll just give you the key. You can go in there on your own and go looking for your cell phone. I hope you find it. And when you're done, just bring the key back here. And so Roger said, thank you very much. He took the key, he left the office, and he made his way down the hall to the trash room. And when he got there, he unlocked the lock and went inside. A few hours later, Roger's wife came home from work, and when she got to the apartment, Roger wasn't in there. She tried calling his cell phone, but he didn't pick up. And so she walked around the apartment hoping there would be some indication of where he might have gone, like a letter or something, but there was nothing. And so Roger's wife was really concerned about this because this was totally out of character for her husband to go out at night on his own. And so she, operating on a gut instinct, called the police and reported him missing. And so a few minutes later, 2 police officers show up at this apartment building. They go up to Roger's apartment, they speak to Roger's wife, and then they go into the hall and they knock on some doors of other neighbors in the area. And after speaking with them, one of the neighbors who had seen Roger earlier said, hey, he lost his phone, and the last I spoke to him, he was going to go down to the trash room to try to see if he could find his phone down there. And so the officers go down to the first floor, they go to the trash room, and they try the door, and it's unlocked. And when they open up the door and they look inside, right in the middle of this totally nondescript windowless room that basically looked like a basement, was this huge green dumpster. And above the green dumpster, high up on the ceiling, was this round opening. And that was the bottom of the trash chute. So when people like Roger and the other people who lived in this apartment building dropped their trash down their respective trash chute on each floor, the trash would come tumbling down and literally fall out of the ceiling into the dumpster. Now, this dumpster was unique. It was not like other dumpsters where the top was just wide open and anyone could lob a bag of trash in. No, this dumpster, only the left side of the dumpster had an opening for trash. The rest of the dumpster was completely welded shut. There was no way into it. And so on the left side, where this dumpster opened up to allow trash to come in, it was positioned right underneath that opening in the ceiling where the trash came tumbling down. And it wasn't just an opening. It was like this near vertical tunnel that was welded on to the top of this dumpster. And it went straight up and it had this big open mouth at the top, almost like a funnel. And it was there to catch the trash as it fell down, and it would go down this tunnel down into the dumpster. And so the gap between the ceiling and the top of this near vertical tunnel, this chute, was maybe 3 or 4 feet. And so when these officers looked into this room and they saw this dumpster and the chute and this hole in the ceiling, they also saw a ladder had been propped up on the left side of the dumpster right up against that near vertical tunnel, as if someone was trying to look down into the dumpster itself. And so one of the officers walked over, they climbed up the ladder, and when they looked down into this tunnel, down into the dumpster, they found Roger. After a lengthy investigation, this is what is believed to have happened to him. After Roger got that key from the manager, he went to the trash room, he opened it up, and then he went inside and found this huge dumpster. And he would have quickly realized the only way to look into the dumpster, and so to go looking for his phone, was to look down into this tunnel. There was a ladder nearby, so he grabbed it and he propped it up against the side of the dumpster, and he climbed up on top and he looked down into the tunnel, down into the dumpster, and as he was looking, either some trash from the ceiling fell down and struck him, causing him to lose his balance, or he just slipped somehow. But either way, he lost his balance and he tumbled into the tunnel, down into the dumpster. And what Roger didn't know is as soon as that happened, he was doomed. Because this was not some ordinary dumpster. This was a trash compactor. And as soon as Roger fell down that tunnel, his body triggered an electronic sensor that activated the trash compactor. And so the way this worked is there was this big metal ram inside the dumpster. There's a ram on one side, and once it gets activated, it will press. There's a hydraulic press that pushes it all the way to the other side. So any of the trash in this dumpster will get compressed against the other side of the dumpster. And then at that point, the ram comes all the way back. And so every time trash would come down that chute, it would trigger that sensor, the trash compactor would start, it would flatten the trash, and so on and so forth. And so Roger has fallen down into the dumpster, he's triggered this compactor, but he's legally blind, he's probably dazed from the fall, and so by the time he realizes what's going on and he's kind of looking around, there is a hydraulic press bearing down on him. And so he probably tried to jump up the tunnel to try to escape the dumpster, but there was no ladder inside this tunnel and it was nearly vertical, so there was no way to climb up and out of it. And inside of the dumpster itself, there was no emergency shutoff switch and there was no emergency exit. And so at some point, it's assumed that Roger realized he was not going to be able to climb up the tunnel. And so he only had one direction he could go, which was to retreat to the far side of the dumpster, as far away from the press as he possibly could be. But once he got over there, there was nowhere for him to go. And so he was forced to just wait as this hydraulic press slowly moved across until it finally reached him and crushed him. Now, we don't know if that very first hydraulic press actually killed Roger. All we know is Roger was trapped inside of this dumpster for several hours, and over that period of time, more and more trash was dropped down the chute, activating the press over and over and over again. And so by the time the police actually looked down into the dumpster, they saw a part of Roger's body, and immediately they could tell there was nothing they could do. Roger was definitely deceased. Roger's wife would sue the manager of the apartment building as well as the company that owned the apartment building for their negligence, but the outcomes of that case have not been made public. So that's gonna do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comment section what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, the next time the like button has a big public speech they have to give, offer them a mint right beforehand. Except this mint is actually a plaque disclosing tablet. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 2 or 3 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and mugs and sweatshirts and all sorts of stuff. If you're interested, go to shopmrballen.com. If you want to learn about upcoming deals and promotions for our merchandise, check out our shop's Instagram page. The username is shopmrballen. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's johnballen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is Mr. Ballen. We also have a second YouTube channel called Mr. Ballen Shorts where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page just called Mr. Ballen where we post condensed versions of the long episodes you see on YouTube. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. On July 4th, 2018, a paramedic was hurrying through a hospital in England when a supervisor flagged him down looking very concerned. She asked him if he had been one of the paramedics on a very specific call a few days earlier. Surprised, the paramedic said yes. The call had been completely typical, so he didn't really understand why this particular call mattered so much. But the instant he confirmed he had been there, his supervisor said she would explain in a minute, but for right now, he had to take off all of his gear, like all of it, right now, because there was a chance that what he was wearing could kill him. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right show because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and remove all of their outlets and then replace it with a blank plate. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of June 29, 2018, a 44-year-old woman named Dawn Sturgis sat on a blanket in a park in Salisbury, England, drinking some wine with a few friends and her boyfriend Charlie Rowley. It was Dawn's favorite way to spend a Friday, especially since it involved Charlie. So they'd been dating for 16 months, and she was completely in love with him, primarily because Charlie was truly like the lone bright spot in Dawn's otherwise really difficult life. So Dawn was an alcoholic who had struggled with an undiagnosed case of bipolar disorder for years. And so she had a hard time finding work. And for the last 2 years, she had actually lived in a therapeutic group home. But it was a little after she had moved in there that she had very fortunately met Charlie. Now, on paper, Dawn and Charlie did not seem like they would be good for each other. Charlie was addicted to heroin. He also didn't have a job, and he was frequently in trouble with the law. And so when they first got together, people in Dawn's life worried that Charlie ultimately was just going to pull her down even further into her own problems. But they did make each other really happy. And so they spent basically all of their time together, going between each other's apartments and visiting the park and hanging out with their friends. And for Dawn, this taste of happiness had made her want to make some positive changes in her life. Now, she still drank alcohol, but she finally got her bipolar disorder diagnosed and properly medicated. and she was feeling stable for the first time in years. She was even planning to move out of that group home and into a new apartment soon, and hoped that, that would give her a chance for a true fresh start. And because of all these changes, Dawn had planned a get-together with her family to show them how well she was doing. It was in a few days, and she'd really wanted Charlie to come with her, since their relationship, at least in her mind, was a huge reason she'd been so motivated to turn this corner. Except, despite how much she adored Charlie and really was excited for her life with him, at the current moment as they sat in the park on this Friday, she actually was really mad at him. So before arriving at the park, Charlie and their friends had done some heroin and some other drugs, and being under the influence of these substances was making Charlie act like a total jerk. Dawn had just bought some new hair dye to give herself a new look for this get-together with her family, and now Charlie, high on drugs, was wasting it by putting it in his beard and his eyebrows as a joke. And so Dawn ultimately was really mad, not so much because he was wasting the dye, but because by dyeing your beard and eyebrows and all that Charlie was going to look like a total deranged mess when he met her family for the first time in a few days. And so when she expressed her concerns to Charlie, he did go and, wash out the dye from his face, and he got most of it out. But even after, Dawn still felt just so annoyed by the whole thing. It's like he knew how important this meeting with her family was going to be. Why would you jeopardize that? And so in the end, even after he had cleaned himself up, Dawn just got up and stormed off, leaving Charlie and the friends to pack everything up. She was done. Hours later, around 10 p.m. that night, Dawn lay on the couch in Charlie's living room, listening to Charlie and their friend Sam Hobson talk about life and how unpredictable and how unfair it could be. Now, Dawn was still feeling annoyed at Charlie, but overall, she was mostly back to being in a pretty good mood. After she had stormed away from the park, she'd gone to her place, and she had dyed her hair with the rest of the dye that was left, and then she'd called her mom. Dawn actually had 3 kids of her own, and 2 of them were adults. But her own mother, so Dawn's mother, had custody of the youngest child, and Dawn was hoping that maybe they could all see each other tomorrow at this get-together. And her mother had said yes, so Dawn was really looking forward to that. But at this exact moment, all Dawn really wanted to do was just go to sleep. So she got up off the couch to go grab her nightly medication out of the bathroom, and just to get there, she had to carefully step around all the junk and just sort of random items that were laying strewn about all over Charlie's apartment. Charlie was always going out and finding things out on the street or even in dumpsters and bringing those things back home. Sometimes he would sell these things afterwards, but a lot of the things he just sort of kept around. So the apartment was very cluttered. But Dawn successfully navigated the pathway to the bathroom. She grabbed her pills and then went back to the couch, swallowed the medication, and then she lay back into the cushions. Then minutes later, she was asleep. The next morning, Dawn woke up on Charlie's couch a little bit before 9:30 a.m. She did have a small hangover, just a little headache, but by her standards, that was not so bad. She had not drank a ton the day before, so this was a good start to her day. Just a few minutes later, Charlie came into the room and he sat on the couch next to her and said good morning. And between Dawn not feeling that great physically and remembering how obnoxious Charlie had been yesterday with the hair dye, Dawn really didn't feel like talking to him right now. But before she could say as much, Charlie's eyes lit up and he said he'd almost forgotten. He actually had a present for her that he'd gotten a few days ago. And then Charlie, he jumped up and he disappeared into the kitchen, and then he came back with a box, which he said was for her. It was her gift. And this made Dawn forget all about her irritation with him. Dawn didn't get very many gifts. I mean, she had a lot of friends in her life who, wanted to give her gifts, but, they, much like her and Charlie, didn't have much money. And so gifts were not a common thing in her life. And so to be receiving this gift right now was really exciting. And so Dawn smiled widely and she opened up the box's lid, and inside was this clearly very expensive bottle of perfume. And she gasped when she saw it. It was brand new. She would never have been able to afford something like this, and she was shocked, frankly, that Charlie had managed to get it for her. Like, how could he have gotten this? Dawn gave Charlie a very excited hug, and she told him she absolutely loved it. And so she pulled it out and she sprayed some on her wrists and she rubbed them together and she thought it smelled so good. And then she handed the bottle to Charlie and told him to please put this somewhere safe. Then she stood up from the couch with a big smile on her face and she went to get her makeup to go get ready for the day. About 5 minutes later, Dawn was sitting back on the couch with her makeup bag now in her lap, and she was applying foundation to her face and telling Charlie about how she was thinking about putting more dye in her hair, maybe a blue streak this time. But as she finished her foundation and reached for her powder, she felt her headache suddenly intensify. She winced, hoping it would pass, but pretty soon she started feeling pretty lightheaded and realized she was sweating quite a bit. She stopped talking about her hair and told Charlie she was feeling really weird. Charlie seemed worried and asked if she wanted some pain relievers, but Dawn just shook her head. She'd already taken her meds that day and didn't want to take more pills because it could upset her stomach. Instead, she handed her makeup bag to Charlie and asked him to go put it back in the bedroom, and then she hurried to the bathroom to splash some water on her face. And by the time she got in there and actually began putting the water on her face, it was like her whole body felt like it was on fire. She was sweating so much, to the point where she felt like this water wasn't enough. And so she actually just climbed into the empty bathtub and just figured the cold tile of the tub would feel good against her hot skin. But as soon as she climbed in and laid down, she felt her breath start to catch in her chest. From the living room, Charlie heard Dawn in the bathroom, and he heard the sound of the water turning on and then off, and then the sound of Dawn rustling around in there. Now, he was somewhat worried about her, but he also knew she regularly had hangovers, and she clearly had one now, and so he figured, that's what this was. He also really wanted to leave right now and go meet up with his friend Sam to shoot up some more heroin, because that would take the edge off his headache and his nausea. However, before he could do that, he heard a weird sound coming out of the bathroom where Dawn was. At first, he wasn't even sure what it was, but then he realized it was a gurgling sound. And so at this point, he jumped to his feet and he hurried to the bathroom door, and as soon as he opened it, he gasped, because Dawn was laying there in the empty bathtub, fully clothed, and frothing at the mouth. Charlie had no idea what was happening, but he instinctively ran over to her, pulled her out of the tub, and he laid her on the floor, and he could tell that she was basically unconscious and she was limp, and in fact, when he listened closely to her mouth, he couldn't even tell if she was breathing. And so Charlie's thinking, this is not a hangover, this is something way more serious. So he ran and got a phone and he called the emergency line. And when the dispatcher picked up, Charlie frantically explained what was going on, that, Dawn, his girlfriend, had just collapsed in the bathtub out of nowhere. The operator got his address and said they would send a paramedic, but they also told Charlie he would have to do CPR on Dawn while he waited, and so they explained to him how to do that over the phone. Charlie was horrified, but he tried to take a deep breath and do what they said so he could help Dawn, so he kept the phone by his side while he straddled Dawn and gave her chest compressions. It would take an agonizing 19 minutes before a single paramedic finally arrived. And by that time, Dawn had begun to turn blue. Charlie paced around anxiously inside of his apartment while the paramedic took over chest compressions. Charlie could hear the paramedic calling for more help on his radio, and sure enough, a few minutes later, more paramedics streamed inside. And at first, this made Charlie feel hopeful, like more medical support meant that Dawn was going to be okay here. But then, from his spot out in the living room, he heard one of the paramedics say something about drugs, like this could be an overdose or something. Charlie heard that and he called out that Dawn didn't do drugs, but the paramedics did not seem to hear him. And a second later, their voices got more urgent. They were using a lot of medical terminology that Charlie didn't understand, but he did catch one thing. Dawn's heart had apparently stopped. Now, the paramedics were actually able to get her heart beating again, but it took them more than an hour to get her stable enough to move her from Charlie's apartment to the hospital. And Charlie, he just watched in panic and despair as they loaded his girlfriend on a stretcher, and then he followed them out of the apartment to stay with Dawn for as long as he could. And then before they put her into the ambulance, he leaned in and he told her he would meet her at the hospital. As the ambulance doors closed and the sirens came on, Charlie's friend, Sam, appeared, looking very shocked by the commotion. They'd had plans to go to a church event that day that had free food, which Charlie had totally forgotten about. But Charlie told Sam everything that had happened and said he had to skip out on that event because he needed to go to the hospital as fast as he could to meet Dawn. But even as he was saying this out loud, he knew he really couldn't do that, because if he went to the hospital right now, he had no idea how long he'd be there. And since he was addicted to heroin, he would start to get sick from withdrawal if he didn't get some drugs in his system first. And so Charlie felt trapped. He really didn't know what to do here, and he sort of felt like he was on the verge of breaking down. This was just so much. But then he remembered he had a methadone prescription at the local pharmacy. Methadone is a drug that's often given to people who are addicted to heroin, who are, trying to get clean. And this drug is used to help them with addiction and withdrawal symptoms. It sort of closely mimics what the body would feel if it shot up the drug, but without, the euphoria and the actual high sensation of using the drug. Now, Charlie had not actually filled his methadone prescription yet, mostly because he was not focused on getting clean. But as he's thinking about needing to be at the hospital all day and needing to be, coherent and being able to talk to doctors and nurses and Dawn, he thought, well, hey, I'll go fill my methadone prescription. I'll take that. It'll keep me, from getting sick, but I'll also be clear-minded so I can be in the hospital and help Dawn. So Charlie asked Sam if he would come with him on a different outing to go to the pharmacy to get his methadone. A couple of hours later, at around 3:30 p.m., Charlie got back to his apartment with Sam. It had been incredibly hot outside, and walking around for that long, they now were both dripping with sweat. After they had gone to the pharmacy, Charlie and Sam had actually gone by that church event, but not really to get food, but instead to literally go say a prayer for Dawn. Now, they were back at his place to pack up a bag both for himself and also for Dawn that they would bring to her at the hospital, and then Charlie didn't really know how long he would be there, but he now had his methadone and figured he'd be okay. But as Charlie was doing this, it was like he couldn't think straight. He had this really intense headache, and even though it had been hot outside, it was like he just couldn't stop sweating. And so Charlie was thinking to himself, maybe it's the methadone. He had never done it before, and maybe this is like a byproduct. Maybe these are symptoms from taking methadone. So he decided he would just take a shower, thinking that would kind of, clear out these symptoms and he'd be back to normal. But after the shower, he felt even worse. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw his pupils were now constricted to little pinpricks. But he still tried to press on here, and he went into his room to get dressed and to finish packing Dawn's bag. But as just a couple of minutes went by, he noticed his heart began to race. And as it raced, it got faster and faster, like he couldn't calm it down. Now, over the past couple of days, between the methadone and heroin, Charlie had basically used a lot of drugs. But he did drugs all the time, and he'd never felt this combination of symptoms before. And so Charlie, he leaves the bedroom and he goes into the living room and he just sits down on the couch, feeling completely awful. And he has this thought come to him. He's thinking, okay, I don't think it's the drugs, because I always do drugs, and this is not it. I've never felt this way. And he looks over at Sam, his friend, and he has this weird thought that it's like, what if Sam poisoned me? What if that's what's going on here? What if I've been poisoned? And without really thinking through how or when this could have happened or why, Charlie began berating Sam, saying, "You poisoned me! Why did you do this to me?" And Sam was so caught off guard that he was like, "What are you talking about?" And he began backing away. And Charlie, he just jumped up off the couch and began to pursue Sam like he was going to attack him. But after only taking a couple of steps away from the couch, Charlie's mouth filled up with so much saliva that he stopped being able to speak clearly. All he could do was kind of gurgle and spit out this froth, and then his legs got so weak and wobbly that he had to lean against the wall just to keep from falling down. And then he felt his whole body begin to seize up, and then the last thing Charlie was aware of was his friend Sam grabbing a phone and calling for an ambulance. About an hour later, inside of the emergency room of the Salisbury District Hospital, the on-call doctor stood in Charlie Rowley's treatment room while a nurse at his bedside took his blood. The doctor had just finished examining Charlie, who was now unconscious. He'd clearly had a seizure, and now he had a fever. He had constricted pupils, and he had labored breathing. So clearly, to the doctor, Charlie's condition was very serious. But the doctor was sure he knew exactly what had caused it. Charlie had overdosed on drugs. And the doctor really felt strongly about this because Charlie's girlfriend, Dawn, had been treated that morning for the exact same thing. She'd been brought in after her heart stopped, and she'd had a lot of the same symptoms as Charlie. Now, they had stabilized her, but she'd been admitted to the intensive care unit and was still listed in critical condition. And so the doctor felt really confident in his diagnosis of both Dawn and Charlie because the symptoms fit. And the officer in charge of both cases had confirmed that Charlie, at least, was a known drug user. and the apartment where they'd both been found had been full of needles and other drug paraphernalia. Over the next 24 hours, neither Dawn nor Charlie got any better. In fact, they both got much worse. Their nervous systems began to completely break down, meaning that essential body functions like breathing were beginning to fail. Dawn was literally in a coma and being kept alive by a life support machine, and Charlie was also still unconscious, and his breathing had declined to the point where they had to put him on a ventilator. He'd also been moved to the intensive care unit, same as Dawn. And so at this point, Charlie and Dawn no longer looked like they had simply overdosed on drugs. It seemed like maybe they actually took a bad drug, like there was, poison in the drugs they took perhaps, or something completely different. But none of the medical staff could figure out what was actually wrong. It was totally anomalous. By the afternoon of July 3rd, so 3 days after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized, one of the doctors in the intensive care unit where they were, his name was Stephen Jukes, he had officially taken over both of their cases. Dr. Jukes had seen the results from the initial toxicology screenings, and they showed that while Charlie did have a significant amount of heroin and other drugs in his system, Dawn did not. All her results showed was that she'd taken some prescription psychiatric medication, and so Dr. Jukes had sent more of their blood to another lab to test for a wider range of drugs, so he was waiting on those results. But admittedly, he was losing faith that the results he was going to get would give him his answer. Now, by this point, Dr. Jukes had ruled out some things that could have caused their symptoms. Like at one point, they believed that, maybe the two had been exposed to a gas leak in Charlie's apartment, because some of the symptoms you get with the gas leak are similar to what they had. But the main reason this theory didn't really work out is, Dawn and Charlie had been in the apartment together that morning that Dawn was brought into the hospital, but only Dawn was affected. Charlie wasn't. And so presumably they were both being exposed at the same time to, if there was a gas leak. But then Charlie, he leaves the house for several hours, so he's out completely unexposed to whatever was in there. He comes back into the apartment, and then he feels sick. It didn't really add up. If he got sick from a gas leak in the apartment, it should have happened at the same time as Dawn. Also, the first responders, when they were in there working on Dawn, they didn't report smelling anything odd. Now, of course, some leaks like carbon monoxide, you wouldn't be able to smell that, but a typical gas leak, you would be able to smell. It smells like rotten eggs. Plus, you also have the fact that when Charlie got sick, Sam, his friend, was in the apartment as well, and he did not get sick. So, all told, the gas leak theory seemed to not be it. Dr. Jukes had also briefly wondered if maybe what had happened to Dawn and Charlie was connected to this strange toxin exposure case that had come through the hospital a couple of months earlier. However, the victims in that case were from out of the country, and Dawn and Charlie had not been out of England, so Dr. Jukes had ruled that out as well. But Dr. Jukes did have one theory he still thought was a good one. Maybe this was pesticide poisoning. It matched with their symptoms, and Dr. Jukes knew that sometimes street drugs can be contaminated with pesticides. So if Dawn and Charlie had both taken something that Dr. Jukes hadn't tested for yet, then they could have maybe been exposed that way. He had told the police about this theory, and so they'd issued a press release encouraging drug users to be extra cautious in case, there was this pesticide out there. But Dr. Jukes also knew that drugs were not the only way people could be exposed to pesticides. Simply eating, drinking, or breathing in contaminated food or water or air could be fatal. And this was extremely troubling to Dr. Jukes and everybody else involved with the case. Because if Dawn and Charlie had been exposed to potentially deadly chemicals just by doing normal things in their home or neighborhood, that meant that basically everybody else in their neighborhood was also in danger of getting sick too. Now, until Dawn or Charlie woke up again, they were not going to be able to figure out, where they had been or what they had touched or ingested before they got sick. So Dr. Jukes felt like he needed to get that information from somewhere else, and fast. The next morning, July 4th, so 4 days after Dawn and Charlie got sick, Dr. Jukes pushed open a door to a room where Dawn's mother, her 3 sisters, and her son were all waiting. He'd heard they were all here visiting Dawn, and so he had had one of the nurses send them to one of these hospital family rooms so he could speak to them. He was hoping that they might be able to shed some light on where Dawn had been and what she might have eaten or drank before she got sick. Now, Don's family was staring at him with anxious expressions on their faces. He barely got out his introduction before they started lobbing questions at him about what was going on and why the news was describing Don as some kind of drug addict. Dr. Jukes just held up his hand to slow them down, and once they were quiet, he explained that at first they had believed this was an overdose because she had all the symptoms for it. But now, based on how the symptoms had progressed, he knew overdose was very likely not the case here. Then he told them his theory about the pesticides and said he really needed their help with it. He asked them to tell him everything they could about Dawn, her habits, her health history, and the people she typically saw. Dawn's mother said she had spoken to Dawn on the phone the night before all this started, and she said Dawn seemed fine. She had even asked to see her young daughter the next day at the big family get-together they were planning. Aside from that, though, the family said that, Dawn struggled with alcoholism and her mental health, and she didn't always tell them everything. And so they just didn't know much about Dawn's daily life with Charlie or her friends in Salisbury, although they were pretty sure that she rarely ever went outside of the city. But what the family primarily wanted to communicate to Dr. Jukes was that Dawn was not just some nobody the way the news had portrayed her. She was a loving mother and sister and daughter and friend, and she was really trying to do better, and she was doing better. She didn't want much. She just wanted a place of her own and a little more stability in her life, and that's the path she was on. And so they begged him not to give up on her. Dr. Jukes promised he would not. But as he left the room, he couldn't help but feel disappointed. He was glad to know more about Dawn as a person. She seemed wonderful. But he had been hoping for some kind of breakthrough about what exactly had happened to her, and he hadn't gotten that. None of them had been able to give him any answer that could maybe even begin to explain what was going on. And so at this point, he really wasn't sure what else he could even do. But as Dr. Jukes headed back towards his office to try to figure out his next move, he saw a lab tech rushing towards him down the hallway. The tech was holding a piece of paper, and when he reached Dr. Jukes, he shoved the paper into his hands. The tech was out of breath, but told Dr. Jukes he had to read this right now. So Dr. Jukes, he looked at the paper, and he saw that it was the lab results for Dawn and Charlie. And when he scanned its contents, he could not believe what he was reading. The new blood test that he had ordered did not confirm the presence of pesticides or of any other street drugs. But they did show something else. Something so unexpected and so dangerous that Dr. Jukes now knew for certain that Dawn and Charlie were not the only ones at risk here. Everyone was. Like literally everyone in Charlie's apartment building, everyone in Dawn and Charlie's neighborhood, all the paramedics, all the doctors, all the nurses that had treated them, and all the patients in the hospital. Literally everybody. In fact, it was even possible that everyone in the whole city was now in danger. And it might already be too late. And so Dr. Jukes sprinted down the hall towards his office, he picked up the phone, and he called the police. A few hours later, the deputy head of investigations for one of England's counter-terrorism units, Philip Murphy, stood on the street outside of Charlie's apartment building. His team had completely cordoned off the whole building and evacuated everybody who was inside. Dozens of officers and crime scene technicians were going in and out of the space wearing these big protective suits, and they were swabbing surfaces and collecting evidence. Because of those tests that Dr. Jukes had run, Murphy knew exactly what substance had sickened Dawn and Charlie, but he had no idea how they could have come in contact with it. And answering that question was now a matter of international security. Now, not only was Murphy's counterterrorism unit involved, but so were multiple other agencies, including the UK's Secret Service, which is known as MI5. MI5 would deal with the other countries outside of Europe that were now getting involved in this. In addition to Charlie's apartment, the counterterrorism unit had been deployed to the hospital and were making anyone who visited Dawn and Charlie now wear protective gear. They had contacted all the paramedics and all the officers who'd interacted with Dawn and Charlie and made them bag up their uniforms and equipment as biohazards. Some police officers were now sifting through literally thousands of hours of CCTV footage from all around the city from the past few weeks, looking for any signs of Dawn or Charlie. And others were contacting Dawn and Charlie's friends to try to get a sense of their recent movements. At least one friend had already taken officers on a tour of a park they'd all gone to the day before Dawn and Charlie got sick. Murphy actually had a team headed there right now to close it off and start taking more samples. He also had another team at Dawn's place doing the same thing. And so, as Murphy stood there watching the officers in suits go in and out of Charlie's apartment, he knew that really, as big as this was actually just the beginning. He was going to have to be patient, because even though the situation was clearly urgent, he also knew it could take a long time to figure out exactly what happened and why. And so at this point, all Murphy, or anybody else for that matter, could do here was just hope that, the authorities found some answers before more people got hurt. But just 4 days later, on July 8th, Dawn was taken off life support and died in the hospital. And of course, that was incredibly tragic, but specifically for Murphy, he was hoping to get a chance to speak to her. She was, a potential treasure trove of information about how this whole thing happened. And now, of course, he would never get that chance. On July 11th, so 11 days after Dawn and Charlie first got sick, with Dawn now deceased and Charlie alive but still unable to talk, the agencies working on the case had managed to eliminate almost every location that Dawn and Charlie had visited as the source of this toxic substance, except for one, and that was Charlie's apartment. And so Murphy sent the forensics team back to the apartment to search it all over again. That afternoon, a lead officer with the forensics team stood in the middle of Charlie's small apartment alongside some of his colleagues. This lead officer and his team were all dressed in these very heavy-duty protective suits, so they moved slowly around the cramped space as they took samples of surfaces and bagged potential evidence. All the stuff, all the clutter in the apartment made it really hard to get around. There were clothes on the floor and open bags of fabric and dirty dishes stacked in the sink and on the counters and overflowing trash cans. And in the bedroom, there was a bunch of makeup and some hair dye boxes scattered on the floor, along with needles and other drug paraphernalia. There was not a ton of furniture in the apartment, but it was all over the place because paramedics had pushed it around during their response. And other areas of the place were littered with medical debris, like rubber gloves and plastic wrappers. And there was also just some trash and just kind of like random objects, water bottles, plastic toys, piled up on the windowsills. It was almost like there was literally too much in the apartment to even effectively test it all. But as the lead officer walked around doing his best to, identify things to be tested, something on a counter caught his eye. It was an object that looked very different from anything else in the apartment. Now, to understand what happened to Dawn and Charlie, you have to go back in time to 3.5 months before they got sick, when an unrelated older man and a younger woman were found unresponsive on a park bench in Salisbury and brought to the Salisbury District Hospital, the same one that Dawn and Charlie would go to. Now, this older man and the young woman, when they came into the hospital, they were experiencing seizures and they couldn't stop vomiting. But after being treated at the hospital, they actually both fully recovered. And at first, the doctors there, including Dr. Jukes, thought this man and woman were just regular civilians who had gotten sick, maybe from an overdose. But soon, it became clear that both of those things were not true. Number one, they were not just regular civilians. The older man was a Russian spy who had defected to England, and the young woman was his daughter. And they had definitely not overdosed. They had been poisoned. An investigation discovered that the substance that had been used to poison them was this very rare and deadly chemical weapon created by Russia called Novichok, a kind of nerve agent. And so 3.5 months later, after Dawn and Charlie were hospitalized and getting worse and worse, and then that lab tech rushed down the hallway to show Dr. Jukes their new lab results, it was Novichok, the deadly chemical that Dr. Jukes saw printed on the paper. That was in their system. Investigators in the spy poisoning case had never been able to figure out exactly how the poison had been administered to the spy and his daughter. But the item that Murphy's forensics team had found on the counter in Charlie's apartment, the one that kind of stood out and didn't really appear like it belonged in this space, was the item that ultimately solved that mystery. It would turn out Charlie actually found the source of the poison, unintentionally. It was that brand new bottle of perfume that he had given to Dawn on the morning they both got sick. Because Charlie hadn't actually bought this gift at a store, he couldn't have afforded it. Instead, he had found it in a dumpster during one of his many dumpster diving excursions. And that dumpster just so happened to be the exact same dumpster where a Russian agent had discarded the poison perfume after the attempted assassination. So when Dawn accepted Charlie's gift and sprayed it on her wrists in excitement, she had accidentally exposed herself and Charlie to the deadly nerve agent. Charlie would eventually recover from his exposure to Novichok. As for the 3 Russian agents that authorities suspect were involved in this thing, they went back to Russia and have never been prosecuted. And Russia has denied involvement in the poisoning. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. In the early morning hours on a Saturday in 2013, a man dressed all in black hid in the shadows on a side street in downtown Antwerp, Belgium. The man had lost track of how long he'd been there, but he didn't care. He'd hide in the shadows for as long as he had to, waiting patiently for the perfect moment that he knew was gonna arrive eventually. And then finally, stumbling footsteps approached, and the man crouched down and got ready. But before we get into that story, you may have noticed that today is a Wednesday, and you may be asking yourself, why am I getting a new story on a Wednesday? Well, beginning this week, you're gonna get 2, 3, even 4 new Mr. Ballin videos each week right here. So, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we do upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So, if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and lay hundreds of mousetraps inside of their bed. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. After midnight on Saturday, October 19th, 2013, a 23-year-old man named Ode Egilus stood at the bar in a packed dance club in Antwerp, Belgium. The bartender slid 2 shot glasses across the bar towards Ode, and he grabbed both of them, he held one, and he handed the other to his friend, Kevin Rodriguez Fuentes, who was standing right behind him. It was Kevin's birthday, so Ode raised his shot glass and shouted "Happy Birthday" in Spanish over the pounding dance music, and then the 2 young men slammed back their drinks. Ode had moved to Antwerp, Belgium from Spain about 6 months earlier when he had gotten a job as a computer engineer. When he'd arrived, he hadn't known anybody. But he'd met Kevin at a beer festival, and the 2 of them had gotten along right away. And Kevin was from the area, so he'd introduced Ode to a bunch of his friends and shown him the best spots to hang out in the city, and the 2 had gotten very close very quickly. Now, standing at the bar after, taking their shots, Kevin tapped on Ode's shoulder and he pointed out at the dance floor and he grinned because there was a group of young women about their age all dancing together out there. And so the 2 young men, they headed out to the dance floor to go speak with these girls. And from this point on, the night really became a blur for Ode, who kept going back and forth from the dance floor back to the bar for more drinks. But, despite that, Ode was having a great time. It was really nights like this that made him feel like Antwerp was his new home. But he also knew if he stayed out much longer here, he might end up passing out right on the dance floor. So Ode and Kevin and some friends they had just met on the dance floor stumbled out of the club and into the city. When they got out there, the streets were pretty empty. And so Ode reflexively pulled his phone out of his pocket and looked at the time. Now, his vision was fuzzy, but even still, one-eyeing it, he could see that it was close to 4 a.m. And given the fact that it was so late, basically it was the next day at this point, he just told the group good night, and then he turned around to start walking home to go to bed. The next morning, Ode's friend, Kevin, woke up with a pounding headache. His eyes fluttered open, and he looked around, and he let out a sigh of relief, because he was safely in his bedroom in his apartment in Antwerp. He had been so drunk by the end of his birthday celebration the night before that he literally didn't remember getting home. And so now, painfully, he rolled over and grabbed his phone off the nightstand and reflexively texted Ode, along with another friend that had been out with him the night before, asking how they were feeling. The other friend texted right back, but Ode did not respond. But this didn't really worry Kevin that much. I mean, he's horribly hungover. Ode has to be as well, and so he likely is just sleeping it off, and he'll be in touch when he wakes up. However, all day that day, Kevin did not hear from Ode. And then the next day, October 20th, when still Kevin has not heard from Ode,
he really started to get worried. But when Kevin called O'Day to check on him to make sure he was okay, when he put the phone to his ear, it didn't ring. Instead, it went straight to O'Day's voicemail, like his phone was turned off. And to Kevin, this was pretty unusual. O'Day was usually very responsive, even with a hangover. And by this point, Kevin had given him a full day, 24 hours to recover, like he should be in touch by now. What's going on? So Kevin called the other friend who they'd gone out with, who had texted him back the day before, to see if maybe O'Day had checked in with him. But that friend said he also had not spoken to O'Day. And so at this point, Kevin hung up and just decided to go to O'Day's house and literally physically check on him. However, when Kevin arrived at O'Day's house, he found O'Day's roommates, but no O'Day. O'Day's roommates did not know O'Day very well, so they didn't know what was sort of normal and not normal behavior. So when he had gone out for Kevin's birthday party and didn't come back, they just figured he was crashing at a friend's place or something. But to Kevin, this was unusual. To hear that he had not come back, that was not normal. He would know if, O'Day was at a friend's house. And so Kevin was starting to panic. But then Kevin remembered one of his and O'Day's mutual friends had recently gone out of town for a wedding. And so Kevin thought, maybe that's where O'Day is. He's gone with her to the wedding, and that's why he's not here, and that's why he's not answering his phone. So Kevin left O'Day's house and called this friend, a young woman whose name was Oyane. He was hoping that she would have an explanation for everything, but instead, when she answered the phone, it was obvious from her voice that she was also freaking out about O'Day. Oyane said she also had been calling O'Day nonstop over the past day or so, and she couldn't get in touch with him. And so it was becoming clear that nobody had seen O'Day since the night of the birthday party when he set off around 4 a.m. to walk home drunk from the bar. Kevin had no idea what he was supposed to do, but he felt like his friend was in trouble. So he contacted the police and officially reported O'Day missing. The following day, Monday, October 21st, Kevin sat in a small room across from members of the missing persons unit of the Belgian National Police. And as soon as the officers started asking Kevin questions, it became clear that this was going to be a very frustrating meeting for everybody. Because no matter how hard Kevin tried, he literally couldn't remember much at all. His memory of his and O'Day's night out on his birthday were really just blurry images and pieces of random conversations because, he was drunk. But Kevin did manage to remember what O'Day had been wearing. He had a gray hooded sweatshirt and a black and white checkered scarf. And he also knew the area of town specifically where they had gone out. But really that was it. And so by the time Kevin left the police station, he felt like he was really letting his friend down. And he just couldn't handle the idea that now he would just have to sit around and wait and hope police magically found him, when right now O'Day, wherever he was, could be in trouble or hurt or something. He just felt like he had to do something. So that afternoon, Kevin met up with some of O'Day's other friends, and together, they began hanging posters all around the city that had pictures of O'Day on them. Antwerp was a very busy city, filled with bars and restaurants that stayed open very late, so they were sure that somebody had to have seen O'Day while he was walking home. He couldn't have just disappeared into thin air. People don't do that. Meanwhile, detectives in the missing persons unit got to work. Now, Kevin had not given them a ton to go on, but knowing where in the city he and O'Day had gone out and what O'Day had been wearing did actually turn out to be quite helpful. Because with this basic information, police were able to collect CCTV surveillance camera footage from outside of the bars, restaurants, and street corners where Kevin and O'Day had been. And it didn't take them long to pick up on O'Day's trail. The investigators were hoping to find footage of O'Day getting into a cab or some other vehicle, or maybe wandering into a building, or even evidence that he'd been attacked in some capacity. And at first, they thought that is exactly what they'd found. Because on camera footage, around 4 a.m. on the morning O'Day disappeared, the police saw him wandering down this dimly lit side street on his own. His black and white checkered scarf really jumped out on the footage, and the police watched on video as this man suddenly came out of the shadows and rushed O'Day. The man attacked O'Day and stole what looked like O'Day's wallet right out of his pocket, and then the man took off running. And as disturbing as it was, the footage did not actually surprise the investigators very much. While Antwerp was not a particularly violent place, it was a big city, and drunk people wandering home at night did occasionally get mugged. However, what the investigators saw next on the surveillance footage did completely shock them, because after the mugging, O'Day had pulled himself together and kept heading down the street. And on footage taken a few minutes later from a different camera, the police saw O'Day still wandering on his own when suddenly 2 new men rushed up, attacked O'Day, took his phone, and then they ran away. Meaning, in the span of just a few minutes, O'Day had been mugged twice by 3 different people. And none of the investigators had ever seen anything like that. It was like something you'd expect to see in a movie or a TV show about a guy cursed with bad luck or something. But as bizarre as this was, investigators now had something to go on. They didn't know if these muggers, the 3 men, were connected in some way, or if this had truly been 2 random, unconnected muggings. But O'Day's cell phone and wallet had been stolen by these guys. So they could track O'Day's cell phone data and also his credit card info, and the investigators hoped that would then lead them right to O'Day's attackers, and they could figure out what their affiliation was and why they targeted O'Day, and hopefully where O'Day is now. The investigators' plan took a few days, but it did pay off in a big way. By tracking O'Day's credit card, investigators discovered that somebody had attempted to use one of his cards at an ATM in the city. And so they pulled surveillance footage from that ATM to identify the first mugger. Then, by using cell phone tower data and CCTV footage along the route where they saw his cell phone was taken, investigators were able to identify the other 2 attackers involved in the second mugging. And so now they believed they just needed to talk to these thieves to figure out where O'Day was. Fast forward to October 29th, 10 days after O'Day's disappearance, and he still is nowhere to be found. Officers from the Missing Persons Unit interviewed these 3 muggers separately. The police made it clear that they had a pile of evidence here that showed they mugged O'Day shortly before he vanished, so there's no point in trying to deny it. They know what they did. And none of the muggers did try to deny it. In fact, all 3 men admitted that they had jumped O'Day on the street, and they told the police exactly what they had stolen. But they insisted their attacks, the 2 muggings, were not coordinated at all. They just happened to have gotten to O'Day within a few minutes of each other. And then even more importantly, they also all insisted that they had nothing to do with O'Day's disappearance. All they did was rob him, that's it. As the investigators listened to these muggers talk, all they could do was stare in disbelief. The idea that 3 muggers had randomly committed 2 attacks on the same man within minutes of each other, and that their victim had then disappeared in yet another unrelated incident, seemed almost comical. But no matter how hard the police pressed these guys, they all completely stuck to their stories, which was, we mugged him, and then we ran away and we never saw him again. The police arrested and held all 3 men in connection to the robberies that they admitted to doing. But their goal, despite what these men have said, was to find enough evidence to still charge them with the kidnapping, or maybe even murder, of O'Day. But then, a new piece of surveillance footage surfaced from a new camera. And this new footage actually showed O'Day moments after the second mugging. And on this footage, investigators didn't see any of the muggers dragging O'Day away or something. Instead, just like the muggers said, they really did take off after that second mugging. And just like he'd done after the first attack, O'Day dusted himself off and just kept on walking down the street and out of the camera's range, but he was alone. And so now, to their complete astonishment, the police had to admit that the muggers might be telling the truth, and that O'Day could have just kept wandering the streets of Antwerp for hours after he'd gotten attacked. They didn't know, but they know the muggers ran away and O'Day was alone, at least briefly, after the second attack. And also, this new footage made them realize that to really conduct this investigation, they were going to need to search the entire city to see if anyone, anywhere, had seen O'Day. So, in early November of 2013, about 2 weeks after O'Day's disappearance, Belgium National Police conducted a massive investigation throughout all of Antwerp. They visited all the bars, all the restaurants, all the clubs in the area roughly where O'Day and his friends had been out partying. But no matter who they spoke to, no matter where they went, nobody knew where O'Day was or what happened to him. But as they hit all these dead ends, The investigators' search continued, and it sort of slowly migrated north through Antwerp in the rough direction where O'Day had been last seen walking, away from the city center and towards the banks of the River Scheldt, which runs right through Antwerp on its way to the North Sea. On the evening of November 7th, so by this point it is 19 days since O'Day was last seen, several detectives from the Missing Persons Unit stepped onto the deck of a very unique structure that literally floated on the River Scheldt. The structure was called the Bod Boat. That morning, police boats had been dragging the river itself and were searching the riverbanks with dogs, looking for any signs of O'Day. But the search of this river couldn't be completed without a stop at the Bod Boat. So the Bod Boat was basically a massive club, bar, and high-end restaurant that had been built into a converted ship that was moored right in the middle of the stretch of the river that police were dragging. But the biggest attraction of the Bod Boat was not the food or the dancing. It was the almost Olympic-sized swimming pool that had been built into the deck of the ship, and it looked like it was floating right on top of the river. People referred to it as the world's largest floating swimming pool, and it was always packed. The Bod Boat had a very good, very wide, unobstructed view of the city and the river, and so the detectives were hopeful that if O'Day had passed by, someone on the Bod Boat likely would have been able to see him. So now the detectives split up and began interviewing the Bod Boat staff and the patrons, asking if any of them remembered seeing a young man in a distinctive black and white checkered scarf on the morning he went missing. Now, at this point, pretty much everybody in the city had already heard of O'Day. I mean, his face was plastered on posters everywhere, and people really wanted to help. But as detectives talked to everybody at the Bod Boat and the pool and the bar and the restaurant, everybody, as much as people wanted to help and thought they might have tips that could help, nobody had anything that was meaningful. And so eventually, the investigators had to leave the Bod Boat, and they just spent the rest of the afternoon on the banks of the river, watching the Marine unit do its work. But just like on the Bod Boat, there was nothing found in the river itself. On November 19th, 2013, so now 1 full month after O'Day's disappearance, friends and family gathered publicly, both in Antwerp and his hometown in the Basque country of Spain. In Spain, his family made it clear that they still hoped O'Day would be alive, and that this gathering was not a memorial. It was instead to show their love for O'Day and to bring continued attention to his story so he could be found. In Antwerp, O'Day's friends tried to convey the same message with their meetup, that O'Day had to be out there somewhere and he might be okay. We just need to keep looking. However, by the end of 2013, so now over 2 months after O'Day's disappearance, it became clear that the police investigation was really not making much headway at all. Police still had those 3 muggers in custody in hopes that maybe they would crack and they would admit that they had done something to O'Day after the muggings. But the 3 men had not changed their stories at all. And also, after over a month of canvassing the entire city, no new evidence had really surfaced at all. And so O'Day's friends and family really began to worry that the police might just abandon the search because there was nothing they could do. But then, starting in the early summer of 2014, so a little more than 7 months after O'Day first disappeared, something incredible happened. O'Day's story went viral, and not just in Belgium or in his native Spain, but all across Europe. And this really is not how things typically played out. Thousands of people go missing in Europe every year, and most of those cases go relatively unnoticed by the media and the general public. It just is what it is. But the story of this young man who had moved to Antwerp to start his career and a new life, only to vanish without a trace after being mugged twice in the middle of the night, it just seemed so unbelievable and also resonated with people everywhere. It just felt so tragic. And so as the police, who by this point really had throttled back their search quite a bit, I mean, it's been 7 months by now, as police were showing signs of just basically dropping the case, people all across the continent demanded the police not just continue, but increase their scrutiny. Look everywhere, triple your efforts, find O'Day. And so there's all this unbelievable international outpouring of support from this viral story. I mean, you had poets all over the world writing poems about O'Day, and you had musicians writing music about O'Day. You had charity groups coming out in Belgium and doing their own search for O'Day. I mean, it's like the whole world was rallying to get the Belgian government to act. Like, triple your efforts, find O'Day, he's out there. And then what sort of pushed it over the edge was in October of 2014, as the first anniversary of O'Day's disappearance approached, one of the most famous soccer players in the world, Cristiano Ronaldo, played a game with images of O'Day on his jersey. I mean, his story really had reached basically everyone. And it was at this point that Belgium did act. The Belgium National Police literally doubled down on their efforts to search the entire country for O'Day. They're not just looking in Antwerp anymore, they're going to look everywhere. They also enlisted the help of Interpol, an international police organization, to expand the search to other European countries. And so throughout 2014 and into 2015, investigators in Antwerp revisited bars, restaurants they had gone to during their initial canvass, and they re-interviewed people connected to O'Day. They also made public announcements to let people know they were still looking for O'Day. But despite all this effort, despite really doing their absolute best to find O'Day, they couldn't find him. But then on September 18th, 2015, so 1 year and 11 months after O'Day's disappearance, something happened with the bod boat that changed everything. So to understand what happened, you need to take into account the literal design of the bod boat. So the bod boat really was, this entertainment hub that had been installed in this decommissioned boat. But the boat is not like a boat that we think of when we think of a huge ship or something where there's multiple stories and a huge deep keel that goes beneath the surface of the water. Instead, it was more like a big floating dock, almost like a catamaran-style boat, where it's sort of one level, this big rectangular square, and there really is nothing below the surface. It's more like a big floating dock. That was the bod boat. And on September 18th, 2015, the swimming pool on the bod boat began to leak. Now, remember, you're looking out at the bod boat from land, and it basically looks like a big floating dock with all these attractions on it, including a pool. And so even though you'd see the surface of the swimming pool being at level with everything else, basically right at the top of the river, well, there's a recessed portion that effectively touches down into the river. And so at some point, there's a leak that formed on the base of this pool, and the pool began taking on all this extra water, and the pool literally broke off from the bod boat structure, and it sank to the bottom of the river. Now, luckily, no one had gotten hurt when this happened, but the story had taken over the news. The bod boat was a huge attraction for people in Antwerp, as well as for tourists visiting the city, and so the city immediately began working to come up with a plan to resurface the swimming pool and rebuild the bod boat. Finally, on February 11th, 2016, so almost 2.5 years after O'Day's disappearance and 5 months after the swimming pool sunk, 2 cranes attached to a boat were brought in to latch onto the base of this pool at the bottom of the river and try to resurface it. And on that afternoon, a member of the work crew stood on the boat, watching the water and helping oversee everything as the cranes slowly did their work. And as he kept his eyes trained on the water, eventually, the bod boat's swimming pool, which was still actually mostly intact, broke the surface. And as this happened, a few of the workers let out a cheer, but something in the water caught the crew member's attention. At first, he couldn't tell what it was, but when he leaned down to get a better look, he immediately shouted for the crane operator to stop. The cranes fell silent, and with shaking hands, the crew member took out his phone and called the police. Eventually, once they put all the evidence together, this is what police believe happened to O'Day on the early morning of October 19th, 2013. At around 4 a.m., after leaving his friends, O'Day began his walk home. And like the police already knew, he was mugged twice in a matter of minutes. But after the second mugging, he really did pick himself up and sort of collect himself, and very likely he was hurt, he was scared, and he was very drunk, so likely disoriented, doesn't know if there are more threats coming, doesn't really understand what's even happening, but he needs to get home. And we know he continued trying to walk home for some time because eventually he came in contact with a group of strangers who would eventually come forward and confirm this. But they apparently saw this guy who looked beat up and disoriented. It was O'Day, and they called out to him and tried to convince him to let them book him a cab to get him home. But he was so disoriented and so drunk, he didn't even answer them and he just walked off. But at that point, he had moved fairly far north in the city, and he was getting near the banks of the River Scheldt. So for reference, he had walked pretty far off course. He was not near his home. He was clearly lost. And at some point in his disoriented, scared, drunken state, he tripped and actually fell into the river. Now, the shock of landing in the water likely, potentially sobered him up a little bit, but he was really, really drunk. And so even if he had tried to swim and get to shore, there was a strong enough current that it would have been fairly difficult to get out of the water. And so the current ended up pulling him all the way up against the side of the bodboat. And so once he was there, kind of pinned against the side of the bodboat, right on the side of the bodboat where that swimming pool was, he was too weak and drunk to swim out of the current. And so he just kind of being pressed up against the wall of the side of the bodboat until he had no more energy left to fight. And he was slowly pulled under the surface and forced underneath the bodboat, specifically to the bottom of the recess of the swimming pool, where there's not much space between the bottom of the pool and the bottom of the river. And so he basically got pulled down and got wedged right in that space underneath the pool of the bodboat. And there he drowned. And for more than 2 years after his death, O'Day's body remained wedged underneath that swimming pool. And so for all that time, people are swimming in the pool, not realizing they're a couple feet away from a dead body. But then finally, the swimming pool, sunk to the bottom. It was pulled back up by those cranes, and attached to it at this point was O'Day's body. And that was how they found him. The muggers who attacked O'Day were ultimately convicted of robbery, and they all served approximately 4 years in prison. Now, the muggers were never actually shown to have any direct connection to O'Day's death. And while authorities believe the most likely scenario is that O'Day simply fell into the water, they were never able to officially rule out foul play. O'Day's parents have called for further investigation. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today, I'm going to tell you about a mystery that is both incredibly haunting and incredibly weird. There are so many clues and pieces of evidence in this mystery, but they all basically point in different directions, or in some cases, literally defy the laws of physics. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the like button a nice tasty dessert, a mud pie. But don't tell them you're using real mud. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. Around 1 a.m. on May 16, 2006, a 35-year-old woman named Allison Rivera bolted upright suddenly in her bed in her home in Baltimore, Maryland. Her home security alarm was blaring. But even though that was obviously pretty surprising, it didn't really surprise her, because the alarm had gone off at almost the exact same time the night before. And so now, in the dark, Allison could see the shape of her husband, Ray, as he grabbed a baseball bat, and then Ray rushed out of the room and down the stairs he went, and Allison quickly trailed right behind him. And when the two of them got downstairs near the alarm still going off, they flipped on the lights and they looked around, but Allison didn't see anybody inside of their house, and all the doors were shut. But when she looked at one specific window, she saw it was just slightly open. And again, this didn't totally surprise her, because the previous night when their alarm had gone off, they had gotten in touch with the police, and the police had looked around, and even though they didn't find anybody, they discovered that that particular window that was currently open slightly had been tampered with the night before, which set off the alarm, and it apparently had happened again tonight. But the police didn't think this was an attempted break-in. They said the alarm had probably been set off by a squirrel. Now, at the time, Allison and Ray had, thought that was pretty crazy that a squirrel had set off the alarm here, but it seemed plausible, and the police seemed pretty certain of it, and so they had accepted it and just gone back to bed after, turning off the alarm and shutting the window again. But now, 24 hours later, to be standing in their house, the alarm's going off, and clearly this window has been lifted up again, it just seemed weird that a squirrel's doing this? That just seems far-fetched. Something's off here. And so Allison and Ray, they couldn't help but feel like maybe the police were wrong. Maybe this is an attempted break-in by a person, not a squirrel. In fact, Allison had this nagging fear about what was maybe going on here that she couldn't shake. She wondered if someone might be out to get her husband, Ray. Ray and Allison had recently moved to Baltimore because Ray had gotten a job at this financial investment firm called Stansberry & Associates that was in the city. Ray's actual job was to write the firm's email newsletter, which gave advice to subscribers about buying and selling stocks. But Ray didn't actually know anything about investing. His background was in screenwriting and freelance videography, not finance. And the only reason he'd gotten the job was because one of his friends owned the company and had basically hired him as a favor. So even though Ray was sort of trying his best here, some of the advice that he was pumping out in this newsletter was terrible, and people had very likely lost money because of it. So it felt possible that maybe one of these disgruntled subscribers could have found Allison and Ray's address and was now trying to get even with Ray. But even though this seemed plausible, that theory was kind of wild and conspiratorial, and so on this night, Allison didn't say anything about these fears to Ray. Instead, she just went over and turned off the alarm while Ray did a sweep of the house and then also made sure this window was firmly shut. And then afterward, Allison asked Ray if maybe they should call the police again. But, Ray just said no. He said, very likely it was just a squirrel like the police said, and so the house is safe, we're okay, let's just go to bed. And so even though Allison felt pretty uneasy here, she said okay, and the two of them went back to bed. Early the next morning, Allison sat at the dining room table and quickly ate the breakfast that Ray had made for her. She was leaving that morning for a business trip 3 hours away in Virginia, and she needed to get on the road. So after finishing her food, she put her plate in the sink, and then Ray carried her suitcase out to her car for her, and then she and Ray exchanged I love yous, and then Allison got into the car and drove off, waving at Ray as she left. 3 hours later, Allison made it to Virginia. She would spend the entire day working, and then finally, at about 6:30 p.m., she checked into the hotel where she was staying. By this point, Allison was so exhausted that she practically collapsed onto the hotel bed. All she wanted to do was just check in with Ray, watch a little TV, and go to sleep. So she took out her phone and she called him. It rang a few times, but just went to voicemail. So Allison waited and then tried again. But the same thing happened, which was odd. Allison wondered if Ray wasn't picking up because something had come up with work or maybe family. Normally he would answer, and certainly he'd be expecting a call from her around this time. But fortunately, one of Allison's colleagues, whose name was Claudia, was actually staying with them in Baltimore. She was traveling through the area, and so that night, she was going to be there with Ray. So Allison called Claudia, who did pick up, and she asked Claudia if Ray was around. And what Claudia said was pretty surprising. She said a couple hours earlier, so between 5 and 6 o'clock, Ray had been at the house. He'd been doing something on his computer down the hall from the guest room where Claudia was staying. And from the guest room, Claudia said she heard Ray's cell phone ring. He picked up the call, and a few seconds later, he said, quote, "Oh shit." Then Ray, literally, according to Claudia, sprinted out of the house. Claudia heard him climb into his car, and he peeled out of the neighborhood. Claudia said she had no idea where he'd gone, and he still was not back. Now, obviously, Allison was confused when she heard this, but she did not immediately panic. She figured that whatever had sent Ray running out of the house was probably just an emergency with work or friends or family, which, could be bad, but she assumed Ray would call her back and explain everything as soon as he got a chance. And so Allison thanked Claudia, doing her best not to give off any vibes that she was worried, and then she hung up and began getting ready for bed. And the whole time, Allison is watching her phone, waiting for what she is sure will be a call from Ray. The next morning at 5:30 a.m., Allison woke up to the sound of her phone finally ringing. She felt this immediate jolt of hope that it was Ray calling to explain what was going on, but when she looked at the face of her phone, she saw it was actually Claudia calling. But she figured, okay, maybe Claudia is with Ray and she has an update that everything's fine and that this is all going to be explained. And so Allison picked up and she goes, "Hey, Claudia, is my husband back? Is everything okay?" And Claudia said, "Your husband has not come home yet. I have no idea what's going on with him, but I have to leave. I have to go to the airport." At this point, Allison couldn't even hide her worry in her voice. I mean, she basically was completely panic-stricken. What was going on with Ray? It was completely unlike him to stay out all night, miss her calls, and still not be home. Like, she had no idea what was going on here. So she told Claudia, who at this point is basically saying, "Do you want me to stay and wait for your husband?" She was sort of insinuating this. Allison told Claudia, "Go ahead, go to the airport, do your thing. I'm going to cancel my work trip. I'm coming home. I got to figure out what's going on with Ray." As soon as Allison was off the phone, she packed up her stuff, she checked out at the hotel, and began the 3-hour drive back to Baltimore. As she drove, she did her best to stay calm, but, she's calling Ray's cell phone basically the whole time, over and over and over again, and he wasn't answering. And then eventually, when she would call, it wouldn't even ring. It would just go straight to voicemail, suggesting that his phone was turned off or maybe, had died. And at that point, Allison really couldn't control her panic. I mean, she knew something's wrong here. She had this theory that had something to do with her husband. She couldn't prove it. She had no evidence. It just felt like something bad has happened here, and she had no idea what it was. And so Allison spent the rest of the drive frantically calling Ray's workplace, his friends, his family, asking everybody if they had heard from him or if they had called him and said something that freaked him out the previous evening, anything. But everyone she spoke to said they had not seen or heard from Ray. When Allison finally pulled onto her street, she had this hope, this small hope that she would get home and Ray's car would be there and Ray would be inside and he'd have a story that would explain this whole crazy thing. But no, she got there, his car was gone, the house is empty, and she just knew something is definitely wrong. And so she turned right around and drove to the police station. However, when Allison reported her husband was missing to the police, it was immediately clear to her that the police were not really that concerned. Ray was an adult who had apparently left the house of his own volition. He also hadn't even been gone for a full 24 hours yet. So the police took down Allison's report and they did tell her they would look for him. But she just felt like they were not nearly as concerned as she was. But Allison and Ray's friends and family were definitely concerned. And over the next few days, they flocked to Baltimore to support Allison and also to help look for Ray. They drove all around the city, literally looking for Ray, but they didn't see any sign of him anywhere. They called local hospitals and asked about any John Does who maybe had come in, but none of them matched Ray's description. They also checked Ray's bank records, but he hadn't used any of his cards since he had disappeared. And as days passed with no new information and no new updates from police, Allison only got more and more desperate. And so finally, one afternoon, a couple of days after Ray first went missing, she just started looking through her own house, looking for any clues about where Ray had gone. And eventually, when she was in that room where Ray had been on his computer, when Claudia had heard him, swear into the phone and bolt out of the house, in that room at Ray's desk, she did find something strange. It was this piece of paper that was folded up really small, and it was wrapped in plastic, and it was taped to the back of his computer monitor. And so Allison peeled off the tape, she opened up the bag, and she unwrapped the paper. And what she found is it was a typed letter addressed to, quote, brothers and sisters. And then the actual contents of this letter made absolutely no sense. It referenced some kind of secret society called the Council. It talked about secrets and some kind of game, and it also contained 3 lists. One with technologies like Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. There was one with a bunch of movie titles that seemed to be completely random. And also there was one with names of real people, but they included celebrities and also some of Ray's family members. Now, to any random person, this note would have probably looked pretty unhinged, maybe even like a possible manifestation of serious mental illness. But to Allison, it actually didn't read that way. She knew Ray was very interested in conspiracies and secret societies from a creative standpoint. And so after a brief moment of confusion when she first read this thing, she decided, maybe this document was him collecting ideas for a new screenplay. It wouldn't have surprised her at all if he was trying to write a script about the council, whatever that was. But what did surprise Allison was the way this letter was printed, folded up, and then taped to the computer. It just seems so weird. So Allison actually took the note to the police station and handed it over to the officer in charge of Ray's case. The officer took it as evidence and said they'd be in touch with her about it. But they weren't in touch, and more days went by and Ray didn't show up and there were no updates from police, and so Allison really didn't know what to do. But then on May 22nd, so 6 days after Ray disappeared, Allison was at home when she got her call from her parents. They said they'd been driving around the city looking for Ray, and they had found something. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Heaviness in your life doesn't usually announce itself. Typically, it just sort of hits you. For example, when I left the military and had to reintegrate back into civilian life, that meant I was leaving behind a clear mission, I was leaving behind tight-knit bonds and an identity that was built on service and purpose, while I was also trying to find my place in a world that felt very unfamiliar. And so this made me carry this really deep emotional weight that I was not expecting. Now, at the time, I kind of told myself that feeling, that heaviness inside of me, that it would just sort of pass with time. Once I get situated as a civilian, it'll just go away. But it didn't. And eventually, I began to wonder, why am I still struggling with this? Why do I still feel this really intense weight on me? Well, the reason for that is emotional weight does not just disappear because your life moves on. It stays with you unless you deal with it. That heaviness, it's not like a symbol of a failure in your life. In reality, it's just your brain holding on to what at one point was keeping you safe. Now, if you're feeling this way, having some awareness around this definitely helps. But untangling it, getting this weight sort of off your shoulders, often requires someone trained to help you let it go. The new year is not about pretending the past didn't happen. It's about finding support that helps you feel lighter moving forward. A great starting point for anybody who thinks they could use this type of service is BetterHelp. With over 30,000 licensed therapists, you'll have access to a diverse community of professionals across different specialties, backgrounds, and locations. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/mrballen for 10% off your first month and take a step toward feeling lighter in 2026. A few minutes later, Allison skidded into a parking lot in downtown Baltimore and parked her car right next to her parents' car. The area was swarming with police officers and news vans, and through this chaotic crowd, Allison could see what they were all looking at. It was Ray's car. And so Allison jumped out of her vehicle and she ran to the nearest police officer and she asked them what was going on. And they told her, after Allison's parents had called her about Ray's car, that was the thing they had found, they'd called the police and officers had come to investigate. And they discovered that Ray's car had a parking ticket on the windshield that showed it had been parked in this lot for 6 days. So since the evening of May 16th, which meant Ray's car had been right here since the night he'd gone missing, which was May 16th. The officer told her that none of Ray's belongings, like his phone or his money clip, were inside the vehicle, and there was no sign of a break-in, so they weren't stolen from the vehicle. So on the surface, it appeared that on the night Ray went missing, he'd driven here, parked in this lot, gotten out, but after that, nobody knows what happened. This discovery sent Allison's fear and panic to a whole new level. And it also seemed to make the police and the public take Ray's disappearance much more seriously. All of a sudden, people all over the city were looking for Ray. And 2 days later, on May 24th, so this is 8 days into Ray's disappearance, a volunteer search party decided to go onto the roof of a downtown parking garage to get a better view of the city to help with their search for Ray. And when they got up there, they saw something that, if it had to do with Ray, it was very dark. And so they called the police. Adjacent to this parking garage was a historic building called the Belvedere. It used to be a hotel, but now it was just a condo complex. The Belvedere, at its highest point, was 13 stories high. But it also had a smaller section that was still a part of the Belvedere that was just 2 stories high, and they kind of butted up against the 13-story section. From the top of the parking garage where the search party was, they could see the Belvedere, of course, but they could also look down and see the roof of the smaller section of the Belvedere. They could see the very top of that building. And on the roof, they saw 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a cell phone, and a very obvious hole in the roof. Within the hour, a detective named Michael Bayer and a team of Baltimore PD officers followed a concierge down the hallway of the Belvedere Hotel building. When Detective Bayer and his team had arrived, they'd asked the building staff about a hole in the roof of that 2-story section of the Belvedere, but none of them knew what the police were talking about. The employees said that that 2-story section of the hotel where the hole apparently was closed off and had been for a long time, so nobody, at least none of them, had gone over there, not anytime recently, and so they really couldn't speak to there being a hole or not. It was fell through the roof down here. That's how he's got here. He came through the roof. But when police examined the hole and also those items that the search party had literally seen from their vantage point on the roof, the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then also when they did an autopsy on Ray's body, they realized that it actually was physically impossible for Ray to have come through the hole into this room, because there were only 3 possible places that Ray could have fallen or jumped from to land on the Belvedere's roof where the hole was. And none of them made sense when compared to the evidence that police had. The first possibility was that Ray had fallen or jumped from the very top of the Belvedere, which is 13 stories tall. A fall from that height would definitely have killed him and caused the devastating injuries found in the autopsy, like broken legs, a broken skull, broken ribs. But the edge of the 13th story roof was 45 feet away horizontally from the hole in the 2nd story roof. And so from a physics perspective, it was basically impossible that Ray could have somehow gone fast enough and then leapt off the roof as fast and as far as he could, that he could have carried himself 45 feet forward before plummeting down and hitting the roof. That's just too far of a distance for a person to jump. The second possibility was that Ray maybe had gone off of a thin decorative ledge that wrapped around the outside of the Belvedere on the 11th floor. If Ray fell from there, he could have landed in the spot where the hole was. However, that ledge was impossible to access without first going through a privately owned condo or office. Ray would have had to be physically let in, but again, nobody in any part of the building had reported seeing or interacting with him. And the third possibility was that Ray had gone off the top of that same parking garage that the search party had been at. It was close enough horizontally that, Ray could have landed in the spot where the hole was. But the very top of that parking garage was only about 20 feet above the 2nd story roof of the Belvedere, which was obviously enough of a height to fall to have serious damage done to your body, but that's not enough of a fall to cause the extreme injuries that were found on Ray's body. It just wasn't enough. And then to make this whole situation even stranger, when police examined those items that were found on the roof, Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and cell phone, they found that all the items were not, helter-skelter, sort of cast around as if he blasted through the roof and everything fell off of him. No, They were sort of organized, placed neatly on the roof like they had been staged on purpose. And also, Ray's glasses and phone were not damaged at all. So it just sort of begged the question, how could this have happened? How did he fall in the first place? How did he wind up in this room? But even if you identify where he fell from or how he fell, how did his belongings wind up placed so neatly on the roof like that without any damage? It just didn't add up. And so the police didn't know what to make of any of this. And so they turned their attention back to a totally different piece of evidence. That weird note that Allison had found taped to the back of Ray's computer in their home. And so they sent that note to the FBI for analysis, hoping it would tell them something. And it did. The FBI said that based on the note, Ray was likely mentally ill and experiencing some kind of psychotic episode. This was not like a screenplay. This was, manifestation of something off in his mind. And the police, this didn't really answer all their questions, but it was sort of a relief. It seemed like, this sort of generally answers a very complicated and confusing situation. Basically, this was enough for the Baltimore PD to stop investigating, although they didn't actually officially close the case, and tell Ray's wife, Allison, and her family that Ray's death, as bizarre as it is, even though we don't really know how it happened, what we do know is that it most likely was a suicide. But Allison was not satisfied with this explanation. Because one, it still didn't answer the question of where Ray had fallen from. That seemed like an important thing to answer. And two, she didn't think Ray was mentally ill, and she was certain he had not killed himself. Allison's theory was that her husband was murdered, very likely because of his job. Here he is parading around like he's got great investment advice and he's pumping out his tips into that newsletter that she knows and he knows are basically fraudulent. He doesn't know anything about investing. The opportunity to basically screw over subscribers was pretty high. People are taking his advice and they could be losing money because of it. And so it seemed entirely possible that somebody who was disgruntled over his bad advice came after him. And then also adding to the idea that this was not, self-harm, that something bad happened to Ray from an outside source. There was that strange phone call that Claudia, the friend, overheard him have when he said, "Oh shit," and then ran out the house. The police were able to trace that particular call back to Stansberry and Associates, the investment firm where Ray worked, but they were never able to figure out who had placed it or why. Because as soon as detectives began asking questions of this firm, Stansberry and Associates hired attorneys and told its employees not to speak about what happened to anyone, not even the police. And so to this day, Ray's case remains officially unsolved. But somewhere out there is the person who placed that final phone call to Ray. This person must know why Ray ran out of his house in a panic that night, and they might even know how he died or who killed him. But as of now, that person has not come forward. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.